On the 1st of September 1939, the German army came rolling across the Polish frontier, and in just over a month, they were victorious. Poland was reduced to a small, German-led rump state, and the Germans then headed off west to protect their border with France. History has written this invasion as a long-planned act of aggression. Some say that the only cause was a German false flag operation on a radio tower. In fact, very little of the build-up is even discussed at all. The blame is just entirely lumped on Germany, and it's just left at that. In this video, I'll explain from beginning to end what actually happened. Why did the Germans invade? Who has to take some of the blame? Why did the Brits choose nearly 100% German Danzig as their red line? After all, we know every war has a build-up, and it isn't always as simple as the aggressor being the sole party to blame. Before we begin though, a very quick disclaimer. This is of course one of the most controversial topics possible, and so I must make it abundantly clear here at the beginning of the video that this is purely a work of history, and is not in any way, shape or form political. If one side or the other appears to deserve more of the blame for the outbreak of the war than the traditional narrative states, then that is all I am saying. For example, if the English had a bigger hand in the lead up to the war than we are led to believe, then this does not mean that I condone German war crimes during the war itself. To equate the two things would be ridiculous, so please use common sense. Thank you. And finally, a huge thank you to my Patreon, Subscribestar and YouTube members who make these videos possible. YouTube is my full-time job, and by far the biggest contribution comes from those of you kind enough to subscribe on these sites, so I cannot thank you enough, as without these contributions I wouldn't be able to make these videos. If you do want to support the channel, join the Discord, or our weekly Hearts of Iron 4 games, then please do consider clicking one of the links in the description. Thank you. In the late 1700s, Poland was unravelling. It was a corrupt shadow of its former self. In previous centuries, Poland had dominated the region, but now, those that they dominated and repressed were on the rise. During this difficult time, Poland would have to be incredibly careful if they wanted to survive, and they did quite the opposite. They won themselves no friends in the region, and the foreigners would impose themselves more and more on Polish affairs. After decades of this charade, Poland was partitioned, not once, but 3 times until it no longer existed. Prussia, Russia, and Austria found common ground against the old enemy, which was now just an unstable mess of a state, separating them all. They vowed together that the very idea of a Polish state must be removed. For the next 123 years, there simply wasn't a Poland. In 1914, the two German powers and the Russians weren't getting along quite as well as they had all those years ago, and they now found themselves on opposite sides when all hell broke loose in Europe. By 1919, the Russian Empire no longer existed, and the Tsar was dead. The Soviet Union took its place. Austria too had fallen. Now it was just a tiny bankrupt republic, and her empire was independent and squabbling amongst themselves. The German Empire had not collapsed, but had sued for peace when things began to go wrong. Now it was time for the victors to decide what the new frontiers of Europe's foremost continental superpower would look like going forwards. Item number 1 on the agenda was figuring out what to do in regards to the new Polish state that the Allies had promised to create. This was easier said than done, however. Margaret Macmillan writes in her book, Peacemakers, quote, "The rebirth of Poland was one of the great stories of the Paris Peace Conference. It also caused endless difficulties. The Commission on its borders had more meetings than any other at the conference. Should Poland's borders be drawn to punish Germany for past wrongs and its present defeat? Should there be a large Poland as a barrier against Bolshevism? What did it need for survival? Coal mines, iron, railways, a proper port on the Baltic?" Wilson had promised, in the 13th of his 14 points, that a reconstituted Poland should have free and secure access to the sea. Like so many of his points, the meaning was elastic. He talked too of giving Poland territory indisputably Polish. Finding territory that was indisputable in Central Europe was never easy. The Poles made matters worse by disagreeing among themselves over whether they wanted the borders from their widest extent in the past, or the Polish heartland, or perhaps a compromise between the two. And of course, the peacemakers were reaching out hundreds of miles from Paris to impose order on a protean world of shifting allegiances, civil wars, refugees and bandit gangs, where the collapse of old empires had left law and order, trade and communications in shreds." End quote. On the ground in Poland, there was only one man who could possibly navigate Poland through the lawlessness that prevailed in Eastern Europe, and this was Józef Piłsudski. Piłsudski was originally a socialist, as were many opponents of the Russian Empire. His overwhelming goal, however, was always Polish independence, which seemed like a pipe dream for most of his life. Now, with the collapse of those giants who had swallowed up Poland all those years ago, he would work his magic. He dropped the socialism and set off to secure a future for his people. When he was released from prison at the end of the war, he was met by some old socialist friends, and they greeted him by calling him comrade. He replied, quote, "Gentlemen, we both took a ride on the same red tram, but whilst I got off at the stop marked Polish independence, you wish to travel on to the station socialism. Bon voyage, but be so kind as to call me sir." End quote. Pilsudski also had a more right-wing rival in Paris, named Roman Dmowski, a devout Catholic with lofty yet different goals for Poland's borders. Pilsudski's task wasn't an easy one. Between 1918 and 1920, Pilsudski fought 6 different wars. Most Polish territory was contested with others finally seeking freedom too. The Lithuanians in the north, the Ukrainians in the east, the Czechs and Slovaks in the south, and the Germans obviously wanted to keep their German lands in the west. On top of all this, he had to mesh the Poles themselves into one state. The Poles had been split into 3 all those years ago, and had over the past century or so developed very differently. The Austrian territories were a backwater, the Russian ones harsh and brutal. The German territories were far more advanced, and the Poles there had developed somewhat of a superiority complex. In the mood of the day, Polish egos were through the roof. They finally had freedom, and now many chose to take it to the extreme, instead of just being happy with their mere independence again. One German reporter said just a month after the armistice, quote, "The Poles are developing an appetite like a freshly hatched sparrow," end quote. There was talk of the borders of 1772 returning, where Poland controlled Lithuania, Belarus, and much of Ukraine. This would have put the Poles themselves at around 60% of their own state's population. Pilsudski, who still had some insane ideas of grand federations, was actually more moderate than the Poles who were trying to work things out at the peace conference in Versailles. Pilsudski said, quote, "All that we can gain in the West depends on the Entente, on the extent to which it may wish to squeeze Germany," end quote. Of the East, he said, quote, "Here there are doors which open and close, and it depends on who will force them open, and how far," end quote. He was completely correct in both cases. In the East, the Poles would fight many battles, but most famous of all was their war against the Soviets. They had pushed deep into the Soviet Union, but they were pushed back right to the gates of Warsaw. Here, however, they managed to turn the tide against all odds, and the Soviets were decimated. Poland gained generous territorial concessions at the negotiating table. In the West, the Poles wanted one thing above all else, a port. Macmillan writes, quote, "Danzig, at the mouth of the Vistula, was the obvious choice for a port. It had once been a great free city under Polish rule. The Amsterdam of the East, people had called it, with its prosperous trade, its rich merchants, and its elegant buildings. Since the 1790s, however, it had been under German rule. In 1919, its population was over 90% German, although much of the surrounding countryside was heavily Polish," end quote. Ironically, the Brits were the least enthusiastic to grant them this. Quote, "The Allies agreed before the peace conference that Poland should be independent. The British, however, were not prepared to invest much to achieve this, since they had little national interest at stake. They also feared, with some reason, that Poland could become a liability. Who would defend it if its neighbours, Germany and Russia in particular, attacked? Moreover, the British did not particularly care for either Polish faction. Pilsudski had fought against them and was a dangerous radical. Dmowski and the Polish National Committee were too right-wing. In fact, the prevailing opinion, said a British diplomat in Warsaw, which to a great extent influenced me at the time, seemed to be that to do anything the Polish Committee asked for would be to fasten upon Poland a regime of wicked landlords who spent most of their time in riotous living and established there a chauvinistic government whose object was to acquire territories inhabited by non-Polish populations." End quote. The Brit in question would be proved quite right 20 years later. The French, for their part, were enthusiastic Polonophiles. In 1917, the French publicly declared their support for a post-war Poland, and not just any Poland, but a, quote, "big and strong, very strong, Poland." Their support for Poland was multifaceted. Firstly, the Russian void had to be filled. France simply could not compete with Germany in terms of population and military strength. The French were deep in a decades-long decay, whilst Germany was at the peak of their powers before the Great War. The Germans were reproducing, the French were not. The French dealt with this in a number of ways. One, of course, was the mass usage of colonial troops to make up the manpower difference, but these tended to be both extremely brutal and extremely ineffective. The second way was using other nations as counterbalances. Recently, this had been Russia, but now the French had a bright idea. Why not create a strong Poland to keep Germany in check? This idea didn't stop with Poland either. French policy for the next 2 decades would focus on building up the Czechs, the Yugoslavs, and the Romanians too, in order to surround and trap Germany. Poland also had other appeals to Frenchmen of all varieties. The story of Poland, rising from the ashes after a century in the wilderness, appealed to liberals, and the Poles' Catholicism appealed to the religious. Prime Minister Clemenceau had grown up around Polish exiles in France. Decades later, at the start of the Great War, the old man would write, quote, "Poland will live again. One of the greatest crimes in history is going to be undone," end quote. The Americans sat somewhere in between the Brits and the French. There were 4 million Poles in the US, and tales of German repression against the Poles whipped up the American masses, much as the invasion of Belgium had in 1914. Wilson, however, found the Polish leaders ridiculous and far too big for their boots. Quote, "I saw Dmowski and Paderewski in Washington, and I asked them to define Poland for me, as they understood it, and they presented me with a map in which they claimed a large part of the earth," end quote. The French seemed to hold far more sway with the Polish issue, however, and they were willing to make moves to get what they wanted. In early January 1919, Marshal Foch, the supreme Germanophobe, proposed sending the Polish army that had been in France at the end of the war back to Poland. The route he suggested was specifically via Danzig, which was still German at this time. He knew full well the Poles would not just pass through. Wilson said, quote, "With the object of sending Polish troops into Poland, we were going to prejudge the whole Polish question," end quote. When the Germans found out about this plan, they threw an absolute fit, and such a storm was whipped up that the French had to cancel their scheme, and the troops made their way by land instead. Even Pilsudski didn't care as much about Danzig as the French did during the situation, and there is no evidence that Pilsudski cared much at all about the city in general. On the 29th of January 1919, Dmowski was invited to explain the situation in Poland to the Supreme Allied Council. Here he, quote, "took the opportunity to outline Poland's claims, or at least the ones he supported. He was not, he said, going to claim everything Poland once possessed. Parts of Lithuania and the Ukraine no longer had a Polish character. Poland was, however, quite willing to help them out, since they were a long way from being able to manage their own affairs. On the other hand, Poland should take possession of the eastern part of Germany. True, much of this land had never been Polish, but there was a great many Poles living there, far more than the German statistics indicated." He said, "These Poles were some of the most educated and highly cultured of the nation, with a strong sense of nationality, and men of progressive ideas. Even the local Germans looked up to them. Poland also needed the coal fields of Silesia and Teschen. Lloyd George listened with obvious impatience, and Wilson studied the paintings on the walls," end quote. Macmillan goes on to explain the perception the Allies had of the Poles at length. Quote, "The Poles had a knack for irritating even their friends in Paris. People joked that when an Englishman wrote a book on the elephant, he dealt with its habitat and how to hunt it. A German wrote a treatise on its biology, but the Pole started with, 'The elephant is a Polish question.' Even the French were alarmed by the extent of Polish demands in Russia, which, after all, might be an ally one day. The British and the Americans complained about the rival delegations. Polish actions on the ground also raised suspicions. The Poles were using, said Balfour, the interval between the cessation of war and the decisions of the Peace Congress to make good their claims to districts outside Russian Poland, to which in many cases they had little right, although in others their claims were amply justified." Wilson agreed. Moreover, the Romanians, the Serbs, and the Hungarians were doing exactly the same thing. Pilsudski was moving troops into German territory around Posen, north into Lithuania, and south into Galicia. The difficulty was how to stop him. The Allies could withhold supplies, but they had not sent much yet anyway. They could threaten, but they had very little real power in the centre of Europe. Indeed, they had been obliged to keep German troops in place along the frontier with Russia. They also hesitated to come down too hard on the Poles. As Wilson said in May, when the Council of Four was considering, yet again, ways of getting the Polish army to stop attacking the Ukrainians, quote, "If Paderewski fails, and we cut off food supplies to Poland, won't Poland herself become Bolshevik? Paderewski's government is like a dike against disorder, and perhaps the only one possible. If the dike went, who could tell how far west the Bolshevik current might flow?" End quote. This dilemma pretty much explains why the Allies did nothing to stop the Poles. The Brits couldn't care less about Poles or Poland, but they did care about the spread of communism. Ironically, one of the most anti-communist Brits at the time was Winston Churchill. His bloodlust and warmongering was a mainstay in his career, from Gallipoli to Dresden, but even now at the end of the World War, he was begging for a showdown with Lenin's Soviet Union. With this issue in mind, as well as the sheer confusion of Central European ethnic boundaries, the The Allies simply threw their hands up and let the Poles get on with the madness in the east. They would simply deal with the German issue. It was decided that ethnic lines must come first, but even here there was some confusion. As well as the ethnic lines, other matters were taken into consideration, including defensible borders, railway lines, and most importantly, access to the Baltic. In the end, the expert commission in Versailles decided that 95% German Danzig should be handed over to the Poles, and East Prussia should be cut off from the rest of Germany. In the end, only 2 areas were allowed a plebiscite. One was Allenstein, a Protestant Polish area in East Prussia. They voted 363,000 to 8,000 in favour to remain with Germany. In the end, over 2 million Germans were to end up in Poland. When Lloyd George saw this suggestion, he said, quote, "Was it necessary to assign so much German territory, together with the port of Danzig?" End quote. Macmillan writes of his thoughts, quote, "He noticed that there was a district called Marienwerder, about 50 miles south of Danzig, abutting East Prussia, which had a clear German majority. Surely its inhabitants should be allowed to vote on the future. The proposed corridor was not fair," he went on. "Worse, it was dangerous. Germany might well decide not to sign such a treaty." He feared that this demand, added to many others which would have to be made on Germany, would produce deplorable results on German public opinion. The Allies should not run the risk of driving the country to such desperation that no government would dare to sign the terms. Were they not creating fresh Alsace-Lorraines and the seeds of future wars by leaving large numbers of Germans in Poland? The Poles, he added unkindly, did not have a high reputation as administrators. The Commission was told to reconsider its report. End quote. Dmowski in France was seething, and he called Lloyd George a, quote, "agent of the Jews," which didn't really make sense, as Poland had the highest Jewish population by a landslide in Europe. He went on to say that the British Prime Minister was the tool of sinister capitalist forces who were opposed to a strong Poland. The reality was that Lloyd George could see the reality which the Poles could not in their current euphoria. They were making a mountain of enemies. They had attacked almost all of their neighbours already, and now this treaty would undoubtedly enrage the Germans beyond belief. He felt the Polish state would not survive. He said in March, quote, "My conclusion is that we must not create a Poland alienated from the time of its birth by an unforgettable quarrel from its most civilized neighbour." End quote. Clemenceau replied to him, quote, "Let the Germans complain. We remember the children whipped for having prayed to God in Polish, peasants expropriated, driven from their lands to make room for occupants of the German race." End quote. Wilson entered the conversation fairly neutral, but he gradually began to see Lloyd George's viewpoint as the far more logical one. After the conversation, the two fobbed off Clemenceau and came to an agreement in a secret meeting between the two of them. Wilson said that if he gave Danzig directly to the Poles, he would have to give Fiume to the Italians, which he certainly didn't want. The two came up with a compromise. Allenstein would be allowed as plebiscite, like in the original plan, and officially, Danzig would be a free city, not directly annexed by Poland for appearance's sake. In reality, the Poles controlled Danzig's foreign policy, defence, customs, railway and postal services, so how free really was it? As a consolation to the Germans, Marienwerder did indeed get its plebiscite too, thanks purely to Lloyd George, and they voted 93% in favour of remaining with Germany. In order to persuade Clemenceau a week later, they really had to stretch the truth. Macmillan writes, quote, "On April the 1st, they persuaded a reluctant Clemenceau to agree. Lloyd George was reassuring. As Danzig's economic ties with Poland strengthened, its inhabitants would turn like sunflowers towards Warsaw, in the same way, he expected, as the inhabitants of the Tsar would eventually realise that their true interests lay with France and not Germany." The Poles were enraged when they heard this news. "Danzig is indispensable to Poland," said Paderewski, "which cannot breathe without its window on the sea." According to Clemenceau, who saw him privately, he wept. "Yes," said Wilson unsympathetically, "but you must take account of his sensitivity, which is very lively. The fact that our troublesome friend the Poles, as Wilson described them, were continuing to fight around Lvov, despite repeated calls from Paris for a ceasefire, did not help Poland's cause." End quote. As the Poles continued to be a menace in the east, Lloyd George punished them in the west. In the Silesian crisis, he thoroughly backed the German cause, and once again, the Germans could solely thank him for what they managed to hold on to from that situation. He claimed, as did the Germans, that without Upper Silesia, they would simply not have enough coal to support themselves and fulfill their treaty obligations. Others, apart from Lloyd George too, had serious reservations about giving the Poles so much German territory. The famous South African Jan Smuts was even harsher. Quote, "Poland was a historic failure, and always would be a failure, and in this treaty we were trying to reverse the verdict of history." End quote. He also said privately that putting Germans under Polish rule was as bad as handing them over to a lot of Kafirs, a derogatory South African term for the blacks there. He also said, quote, "You may strip Germany of her colonies, reduce her armaments to a mere police force, and her navy to that of a fifth-rate power. All the same, in the end, if she feels that she has been unjustly treated in the peace of 1919, she will find means of exacting retribution from her conquerors." End quote. Quote, "We cannot destroy Germany without destroying Europe. We cannot save Europe without the cooperation of Germany." End quote. Quote, "Under this treaty, Europe will know no peace." End quote. Other more moderate men, like Balfour, agreed that there must be more plebiscites, especially in Upper Silesia. The Poles protested to no end. They knew full well they would lose in most cases. Lloyd George replied sharply to Prime Minister Paderewski, quote, "Don't forget, your liberty was paid for with the blood of other peoples, and truly, if Poland, in these circumstances, should revolt against our decisions, she would be something quite other than we had hoped." End quote. In the end, the plebiscites were held in Silesia, and Danzig did end up as a free city. These tiny concessions, however, which were mostly just wrapped up to appear better to the Germans, didn't cut it. In Silesia, the mines were handed over to the Poles, even though the Germans retained the majority of the territory on paper, and in Danzig, the Germans knew full well how free this free city was. The treaty was signed, but the trouble had only just begun. Even Poland itself couldn't remain stable. On top of this, they made themselves pretty much no friends during the interwar period. The Poles hounded their own prime minister for not getting them everything they wanted, and consistently attacked his wife in particular. At the end of 1919, Paderewski resigned as prime minister in disgust, and he never lived in Poland again. In 1926, Pilsudski seized power in a military coup, and he ran Poland along military lines until his death in 1935. Poland by this point was a mess of Poles, Lithuanians, Jews, Germans, Belarusians, Ukrainians, Czechs, and Slovakians. Pilsudski did his best to make sure the Jews, in particular, all 3 million of them, would come to no harm, as they were severely detested, perhaps even more so than they were in Germany. With his death, however, ethnic tensions boiled over. It was during this quiet period that Poland almost invaded Germany. Almost immediately after Hitler came to power, the world's Jews rose up to stop him. From the US to China to South Africa to Lithuania, almost every Jew was united in their opposition against Adolf Hitler. Only a very small group of Zionists saw another route. In the early days of 1933, these Zionists could barely get their voices heard amidst the near-unanimous anti-Hitler movement. Their plan was to use the German Jews' misfortune as a way of making them move to Palestine. Usually, those seeking to migrate were Eastern Jews, who were looked down upon by the more integrated Western Jews, especially those in Germany. It was these German Jews that the Zionists wanted to build their new homeland in Palestine. Ironically, these goals placed the National Socialists and the leading Zionists in the same boat, as they both attempted to navigate the insane tension of 1933. Obviously, in 1933, there was no Israel. The Jews had no homeland. There was only one way that they could have any impact on Hitler, and that was via trade and finance. Spontaneous boycott movements sprung up all over the world, which slowly began to unite. In America especially, the anti-Hitler movement was gigantic in big cities, most prominently New York. The leading members of the boycott there tried to influence US policy and gained access to the president's ear however they could. Their goal was an official US boycott. British Jews did the same. Many of these boycotts became very close to becoming official policy in each country, but none quite managed to do the trick. Only Latvia banned these movements in their own nation, however. Even though there was no official policy supporting the boycotts, individual government members, Jewish or non-Jewish, ended up joining the cause, and soon it could be classified as Jewish-led, but not just a Jewish movement anymore. Millions were whipped up by anti-German propaganda, whether it was the true stuff or the false stuff, that was being pumped out of the radio, television, and newspapers alike at 1,000,000 miles per hour all over the world. Taking a pro-Nazi stance at this stage would make you look like a lunatic against this frenzy of hate. Millions of all kinds of ethnicities ended up boycotting to crush Hitler and starve the import-reliant Germany that winter. It was in this atmosphere that the Polish and Czech governments got some bright and lofty ideas. With the entire world against Germany, they could essentially do whatever they liked, and no one would stop them. The Germans, strangled by the Versailles Treaty, could not hope to possibly oppose them with their tiny army. All of the following quotes are from Edwin Black's book, The Transfer Agreement. Quote, "When the Nazis consolidated power in early March, Polish officials openly reinforced troop strength along the Polish corridor. This was in response to the Führer's bellicose threats to seize the Versailles-created territorial bridge. In late March, the anti-Nazi boycott helped push Poland from a heightened defensive posture to a near hysterical readiness to invade Germany. On April 7th, von Neurath, Schacht, and other key officials briefed Hitler about the Reich's perilous condition in the wake of the accelerating anti-Nazi backlash. Emphasising that various neighbours were actively contemplating a preventative war with Germany while she was still weak, von Neurath told Hitler, "The gravity of the dangers threatening us should not be underestimated." Foremost among the potential invaders was Poland, determined to preempt any territorial compromise. Other neighbours in the east? Romania, Yugoslavia, Hungary, Czechoslovakia would have to be kept on friendly terms, principally through trade, to preclude any anti-German alliance with Poland. End quote. Other ministers reminded Hitler of what happened in 1923, when the Germans couldn't quite make a timber delivery as part of the Versailles Treaty. The French, knowing the Germans could not possibly oppose them, simply occupied the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland. Worst of all, they used colonial troops, who went on a spree of sexual crimes against the local population. Germans could only watch on helplessly as their women were treated in this manner. In 1932, Chancellor Brüning told a newspaper that Germany would consider stopping all reparations, and the French immediately mobilised for an invasion. Now it seemed that the French were getting ideas once again. Edwin Black continues on to write, quote, "The situation deteriorated rapidly. On April the 12th, German Ambassador Moltke in Warsaw reported that the anti-Nazi boycott was inciting the Polish people and their leaders to military edginess. Everywhere the slogan is, destruction of everything in Poland, which is still German, and boycott of everything which comes from Germany," wrote a distressed Moltke. Everywhere straw men labelled Hitler were being burnt. He added that the Polish government's open support for the boycott against German goods as legitimate and useful was incontestable. Moreover, reported Moltke, the Polish foreign minister had warned him that any retaliation against Polish Jews or any others of Polish extraction living in Germany would be met with dangerous Polish countermeasures, the consequences of which were unforeseeable. On April 22nd, German ambassador to Italy, Ulrich von Hassel, reported worse news from Rome. In a one-sentence telegram, Hassel relayed highly reliable information from circles close to Czech President Thomas Masaryk that Prague was planning to support Polish intentions of preventative military action at the German eastern border. No longer confined to preemptively occupying demilitarized zones in the Polish corridor, Poland's military threat now included an actual invasion of Germany proper, and as feared, Czechoslovakia was primed to join her. Von Neurath passed Hassel's telegram directly to President von Hindenburg. End quote. Since war was inevitable, Polish leaders were convinced that they should conquer the East Prussian region of Germany at once, while Germany was still weak and unarmed. The arguments against such a preemptive invasion were Poland's exaggerated fears of non-existent German weapon stockpiling, the financial cost, and Poland's doubts about her own military capability. In balancing the pros and cons, Moltke concluded that the chances of an invasion were even. In an attached memo, Moltke listed proof that Poland was readying should the decision to invade be affirmed. Poland's war industry had increased production 100% since Hitler took office, placing large orders for aeroplane engines, munitions, field kitchens, and the other staples of war. Polish representatives were even then in France purchasing heavy artillery and anti-aircraft guns. Reserve officers had been called up, and the troops due to be discharged had been kept on for additional months of duty. In an ominous show of force, the government had ordered the rapid deployment of 30,000 soldiers and artillery at Vilna just the day before. End quote. In Czechoslovakia, the story was much the same. Quote, "On April 25th at 12:45 p.m, German Ambassador Walter Koch in Czechoslovakia dispatched an urgent telegram to Berlin. There is no doubt that a preventative war is being carefully considered at the Prague Castle, where the threads of all international plots against Germany come together. Recently Masaryk spoke of war as a matter of course. I am convinced that Poland's influence here is constantly pressing for a preventative war, and that the Czechs have the intention to intervene actively." End quote. 3 hours after this telegram was received, Hitler called an emergency meeting with his entire cabinet. They knew how serious the threat was. Edwin Black, who is Jewish himself, I must add before this, concludes, quote, "The Jewish question and the anti-Nazi boycott were a common aggravating factor in Germany's intensifying economic and military problems. Polish Jews had successfully inflamed Poland from defensive concern to war hysteria through their violent anti-German boycott and protest movement. German officials were in fact astonished that the historically anti-Semitic Polish people would allow Jewish persecution in Germany to become a pretext for war. But it was happening. The anti-Nazi movement in Czechoslovakia was encouraging Masaryk's government to join the opportunity. Masaryk believed anti-Semitism to be an evil unacceptable to his Christianity. The international boycott was frustrating every Reich effort to earn the foreign exchange needed to keep France at bay. Events were fitting into the Nazi conception of war, a cataclysmic conflict caused by Jews through economic and propaganda means, but Germany simply was not ready, end quote. Things were on a razor's edge. Hitler's Germany had a very real possibility of being crushed in its infancy. The fate of Germany wasn't in Hitler's hands now. It was up to world opinion and how long they could maintain their current feelings. As we know, news cycles don't tend to last very long. One week, someone will care passionately about a topic, and then the next, they won't care. Luckily for Adolf Hitler, this is kind of what happened. The leadership of the various major boycotts were caught in their own selfish power struggles, and in the end, they were fighting each other more than they were fighting Hitler. Egos and money got in the way, and this gave time for the Zionists to make their move. After months of negotiation, the German Reich and a group of Zionists made a historic deal, which would see large numbers of Jews move from Germany to Palestine. Their assets would be transferred with them in an extremely complicated deal involving German goods, which would fix Germany's current export problems. In the end, the deal killed the boycotts, and they were never the same again. The hype died with the boycotts. The hype killed the justification to invade. Pilsudski was furious at the lack of clear support he received from the West, and in the end, a non-aggression pact was signed with Hitler instead. If France had shown the slightest interest in Pilsudski's scheme, then they would have marched right to Berlin, and the Germans had no way to stop this. Hitler, for his part, had always respected and admired Pilsudski, and was happy this issue was out of the way. The Zionists got their part of the deal and got thousands of highly skilled German Jews who became the backbone of the future state of Israel. Zionism had perhaps saved Germany, and Germany lived to see another day. The Second World War in the history books began when Germany invaded Poland. But the reality is this alone isn't a world war. World War II actually began 2 days later, on the 3rd of September, when the British joined the war. This was the one thing Hitler had wanted to avoid, even before Poland became a factor. Right from day one, Hitler wanted peace, friendship, and alliance with the British Empire. There was no state he admired more on planet Earth. The story of World War II cannot be told without telling the story of Hitler and the British Empire. Within that empire, he had many like-minded Brits. The Daily Express argued that Hitler wanted armament parity for Germany, whilst the French wanted superiority. Many powerful Brits urged common sense. On the other side, there was men like Churchill who wanted war with Germany at any cost. His motives would become apparent later. There was an internal battle within London for the future of the British Empire. They just didn't know it yet. Friendship or hostility with Germany hung in the balance. The decision was mostly out of Hitler's hands, but he tried his best to make the British see his idea of sense. In January 1934, he made a goodwill gesture to the British by returning 7 drums of the Gordon Highlanders, which the Germans had captured in the Great War. In 1935, Hitler signed the Anglo-German Naval Agreement, which imposed restrictions on himself, but not on the British. Hitler gave an interview after coming to power with the Daily Mail. Quote, "On August 4th, 1914, I was very distressed that the two great Germanic peoples, who had lived at peace with one another throughout all the disputes and fluctuations in human history for so many centuries, were drawn into war. I would be pleased if this unfortunate atmosphere would finally come to an end, and the two related nations could rediscover their old friendship. The assertion that the German people are enthusiastically preparing for war is for us a simply incomprehensible misinterpretation of the German Revolution. We leaders of the German nation had almost without exception served as frontline soldiers. I would like to see the frontline soldier who wants to prepare for another war." End quote. Back in Britain though, the British had their age-old policy of the balance of power to keep up. This policy dictated that they would always side with the underdog on the continent, in order to prevent one nation from becoming too powerful. Hitler's Germany was on the rise, and this would make them an antagonist in the centuries-old policy which Britain rarely, if ever, deferred from. There was other concerns too at the top of British finance. Germany's economic revival created competition for the British abroad. Hitler promoted autarky, whilst the British promoted free trade. The German policy could exist on its own, but the British relied on other nations also being open to free trade. This caused an economic rift between the two. Apart from this, there was the social aspect. The class system in Britain is ruthless and unlike anything else on earth. In these days, it was even more pronounced, and there was a very clear ruling, middle, and lower class. This system had nothing to do with merit, and everything to do with your family name. In Germany, things were quite the opposite. Before the Great War, Germany was far closer to Britain's way of doing things, but the Brits had beaten Germany, and the Kaiser was carted off into exile. His system went with him. Chaos reigned until Hitler brought in something new. This something new was a social system based not on your family name, but on your merits. Germans, at least on paper, were all equal. It was all about the greater German whole, not this or that little family and their fortunes and family estates. The system wasn't perfect, and there was bad, corrupt apples, Goering being a shining example with his extravagance, but nonetheless, the idea was there. This system threatened the Brits to no end. The National Socialists spent heavily on improving the lot of the average German worker. Every factory had to abide by strict standards, and certain facilities had to be provided to workers if they wanted to keep their business running. Even little things like window lighting and pretty gardens were enforced to make the working life for the average German more bearable. When they had time off, there was even state-sponsored holidays abroad. This kind of thing would have filled the snobby British aristocracy with horror. Many took their stand on this issue alone. This ideology would not be allowed to spread. One German journalist wrote on the subject of the state-sponsored holiday cruises, quote, "Just when the vacation cruises were about to begin, a representative of the British Consul General arrived at the Hamburg office of the Strength Through Joy programme. He asked whether there was any plans to have German workers' vacation ships put in at English ports. He was instructed to advise us that the British government regards putting in at British harbours, or even cruising within sight of the English coast, unwelcome." End quote. In 1936, Hitler realised that the relationship between the two countries simply wasn't improving, and appointed Ribbentrop as the ambassador to Britain to try to patch things up. The two he placed the biggest blame on for this was Anthony Eden and Winston Churchill. The truth was that both men were on payroll from a group called The Focus. Figures such as Sir Henry Strakosch and Robert Warley Cohen put up millions of pounds to topple the Hitler regime, and their main strategy was simply paying off British politicians. The full list isn't even known today, but it was perhaps over a dozen different government officials. The man they chose to lead the charge was Winston Churchill. His bloodlust had always been insatiable. He cared about no one but himself and his place in history, no matter how many lives it cost. Now he was a bankrupt politician in the wilderness. In 1938, Churchill put his country estate up on the housing market. It was all he had left to pay off his debts. Strakosch stepped in and paid off every penny. In return, Churchill would have to aim his crosshairs firmly at Germany, and only Germany. Eventually, this clique of war provocateurs would weave a web all over Europe. The Czechs, most of all, were in deep with them. During the Munich crisis, the Beneš government paid £2 million to the Focus. In return, they would try their best to topple the Chamberlain government and bring in the war party led by Churchill, whilst the Czechs stalled for time. Hitler caught wind of this move and delivered the information directly to Chamberlain to show him what was going on behind his back. Chamberlain was livid. He knew full well what kind of man Churchill was, but this was a step too far. The issue was, however, that there was nothing Chamberlain could do, and all he did do was bitterly complain to his sister and others about Churchill. The Prime Minister, who didn't know yet that he was dying of cancer, was simply too weak to stand up to Churchill, Strakosch and the warmongers. In 1938, the warmongers would fail, but in 1939 they had infiltrated both the government and public opinion to such a degree that peace never stood a chance. In early 1937, Great Britain launched a massive rearmament programme that dwarfed Hitler's. The programme would triple their military capabilities. During the middle of the year, however, a miracle seemed to occur. Neville Chamberlain came to power. If there was one man on planet Earth who genuinely wanted peace, it was Mr. Chamberlain. He was a man of deep Christian values amidst a sea of snobby, greedy aristocrats and snakes. Chamberlain detested war. He lived through the mess of the Great War, where his cousin died, and didn't wish to send another generation off to die for someone else's problems. He would do his best to find an amicable solution. In 1937 and 38, Chamberlain would be dead set on his mission. He was constantly racked by doubt, but at this time he was strong enough to push on. In a sea of hate, paid warmongers and anger, he stood up to make a last bid for peace, regardless of the detractors at home like Churchill throwing dirt on him and his name whenever he tried. Chamberlain was so honest about his mission that at first Hitler assumed he was like every other politician and was simply playing a game. In November 1937, Hitler once more tried to lower the tempo by meeting with Lord Halifax, and he told the German newspapers to not respond to their provocative English counterparts. Before this, the situation had developed into a mudslinging contest back and forth, and Hitler's own newspapers were causing trouble for his mission of peace. Halifax, however, was all over the place at the meeting. He came off like an idiot. He brought up all the usual points for the British papers. He told Hitler that the National Socialist antagonism towards the church was wrong. Hitler replied that the communists were far worse, yet England never objected. Hitler's movement was pro-Christian, and so was Hitler, yet they had trouble with the church itself, not the religion. Stalin's Soviet Union actively persecuted Christians. Halifax saw the logic and changed the topic. Next, he moved on to Czechoslovakia, Danzig, and Austria. Halifax was asked why this had anything to do with England. He then continued to insist that these issues could be solved peacefully. Hitler said that he never had any intention of doing otherwise. Hitler said that England should take a neutral stance on European issues rather than, quote, creating difficulties for no reason at all beyond pure malice, end quote. Halifax quickly moved on once more, this time to Germany's colonial ambitions. Hitler said that he would like Germany's colonies back one day, which were now mostly all part of the British Empire, and certainly not a vital part of the empire at that. Halifax tried offering him some of Portugal's colonies in return, and asked if that would be suitable. He did the same thing with Belgium. Hitler could barely believe what he was hearing, as the Brits tried offering him up other nations' territory. It was clear, the Brits were living on a different planet than he. Halifax went home without anything much being achieved. Later it would come out that Halifax was one of the warmongers too. In 1938, he openly stated his ultimate aim. The minutes of a 25th of September 1938 cabinet session read that Halifax, quote, felt some uncertainty about the ultimate end which he wished to see accomplished, namely the destruction of Nazism, and followed up that if Hitler were, quote, driven to war, the result might be to help bring down the Nazi regime, end quote. Even Britain's dominions found her actions peculiar. Jean Smuts said that it was time to stop treating Germany, quote, like a pariah in Europe, end quote. Unanimously, Canada, South Africa, Australia, and New Zealand all agreed that the maritime powers like Japan and Italy were far bigger threats to Britain's empire. They told Chamberlain that the Brits couldn't count on military support if she pursued an armed conflict for no reason in Europe, again. Winston Churchill was churning out belligerent war propaganda, both before, during, and after the crisis. On the 9th of May, 1938, the New York Times reported on a speech by Churchill, quote, Churchill proposes encircling Germany, end quote. It was true, and the German press immediately picked up on it and reported, quote, without a two-front war against Germany, a war is not winnable for England, end quote. In the First War, this was the case, and it was even more true now. France was a shell of its former self, and even in the First War, the Germans had almost marched right to Paris at the start. Churchill knew full well what it would take to take down Germany. War scares magically popped up out of nowhere between the Munich crisis and the Danzig crisis the following year. The Churchill clique did all they could to push public opinion towards war. In 1938, Chamberlain returned home like a conquering hero, except instead of bringing home his enemies in a cage, he brought home peace for a generation. Or at least, that's what the public thought and hoped. Chamberlain's fight was seen as the good fight. Why die for a belligerent Czech state that the Brits knew barely anything about? In 1939, however, things would be different. Chamberlain was dying, he was weak, his doubts would swallow him up whole. Churchill and his warmongers trampled all over him. On the 6th anniversary of his rise to power, the 30th of January 1939, Hitler was singing the same tune despite the difficulties. He made a national broadcast in which he said, quote, what conflicts of interest exist between England and Germany? I have declared more often than necessary that there is no German, and especially no National Socialist, who even in his thoughts wants to create difficulties for the English world empire. It would be a blessing for the whole world if these two peoples could cooperate in full confidence with one another, end quote. The English were living on a different planet entirely. Richard Tidor writes in his book Hitler's Revolution, quote, the cabinet met on February the 1st, 1939. Chamberlain stirred Switzerland into the pot, remarking that a German invasion there would be clear evidence of an attempt to dominate Europe by force. The cabinet discussed planning a war against Germany and Italy, even though the two countries were not yet allies. Topics included involving the Dutch and Belgian general staffs in joint defence talks. Cadogan summarised in the meeting's minutes, I agree that in the event of a German invasion of Holland resisted by the Dutch, we should go to war with Germany. There could appear some doubt about the position in the event the Dutch not resisting. For my part, I should say that in this case too, we should go to war with Germany. The attitude of the threatened nation apparently played no role. Decisive was the fact that the Foreign Policy Committee defined German military control over Holland as a peril to England's security. Kirkpatrick's Holland scare did not alarm the Dutch and Belgian governments. Holland's foreign minister noted no German troop movements near the frontier. His Belgian colleague declined London's offer for military talks, replying that he cannot believe the Germans intended to invade Holland, end quote. The crisis was of course completely made up. If the Brits even remotely researched the man who was in their minds their opponent, then they would know he had absolutely no designs on Western Europe. Hitler had in fact written off any Western adventures over a decade ago, and he reaffirmed this fact repeatedly. What on earth would Hitler have to gain in Holland? It showed a sort of typically British naivete, where no one taking charge really took the time to actually look into who they were fighting. Everything was framed as good versus evil, light versus dark. Hitler was a madman. Why bother understanding him? They reasoned. The Brits immediately ramped up their air defences after this. They genuinely believed the lies and insanity before their eyes. Eastern Europe, however, wasn't quite on the table yet. Britain stuck to their policy of avoiding conflict there. In March, however, that would change with an even more ridiculous crisis. Tidor writes of the Romanian war scare at length, quote, "In March, Berlin negotiated a commercial agreement with Bucharest. In exchange for favourable options to purchase grain and oil, the Germans proposed sending engineers to Romania to organise the agrarian economy and build modern refineries to boost oil production. The arrangement was advantageous to both countries. It corresponded to Hitler's programme to release Germany from dependency on overseas markets. He himself stated, 'I don't want free trade, open borders. That all sounds wonderful, but we've had it if everything depends on the Queen of the Waves, if we're subject to a blockade. Then it is my duty to create the prerequisites for my people, to provide their nourishment. That's the real issue.'" Chamberlain's cabinet discussed developments in Bucharest at the session on March 18, 1939. The Prime Minister described Germany's economic talks as a threat to Romanian independence. With military advisors present, the cabinet speculated that German domination of Romanian trade would augment the Reich's political influence in the Balkans. This could spread to Greece and Turkey, endangering Britain's position in the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East. Under these circumstances, the cabinet had to decide whether Germany's economic advantages from the trade agreement with Bucharest warrant the need for Britain to take action. The aide-de-moire, prepared for the meeting by the Minister for Coordination and Defence, stated that England's only recourse was to start a war in the West. The cabinet weighed armed aggression as an option to block a harmless economic compact between two European states. End quote. At around this same time, Virgil Teleia, a Romanian diplomat in London, suddenly rushed around like a headless chicken, screaming that a German invasion of his country was imminent. Teleia said that Germany had issued an ultimatum to the Romanians, that if Romania did not hand over complete control of Romania's agriculture and industry, then they would invade. There was no basis for this claim, and Germany was 300 miles from Romania. They didn't even remotely have a common border. How Germany would invade was not considered. The British ambassador in Bucharest, Reginald Hoare, said that, quote, "There was not a word of truth in it." The Romanian foreign minister said that talks with Germany were, quote, "on completely normal lines, as between equals," end quote. Regardless of all this, the Brits believed him. The London Times and Daily Telegraph began to pump out stories talking of an imminent German invasion. Evil Germany was about to steamroll neutral Romania. On the 18th of March, Chamberlain read out Hoare's telegram in that day's cabinet session. Despite the contents of this report, the PM said that Romania was, quote, "most probably the next victim of a German aggression," end quote. The permanent undersecretary of the Foreign Office, Alexander Cadogan, said that Teleia probably collaborated with advisors in the British Foreign Office to ensure that, quote, "panic was artificially raised," end quote. This could very well have been a man on the payroll of the Focus, like Churchill. On the same week as the Romanian war scare, there was another actual event. But for this, the British didn't seem to care. British policy made no sense. Czechoslovakia was about to implode, as Czechs and Slovaks reached the point of no return. Hácha signed over his country to Hitler, and the Czech side became a protectorate of Germany, while Slovakia became an independent nation, although closely linked to Germany. On the 15th of March, Halifax said to Ribbentrop, quote, "His Majesty's government has no desire to interfere in a matter with which other governments may be more directly concerned," end quote. In the cabinet session that day, ministers agreed that, quote, "this renewed rift between the Czechs and the Slovaks showed that we nearly went to war last autumn on behalf of a state which was not viable," end quote. Just days later, however, Halifax said that the cause of Czechoslovakia's collapse was purely due to, quote, "German military action," end quote. He also condemned the new Czech protectorate as, quote, "devoid of any basis of legality," end quote. Yet the Bank of England remitted £6 million in Czech gold reserves to the German administration. During the cabinet session of March the 18th, Tidor writes what happened, quote, "Chamberlain's ministers agreed that it would not be possible to protect Romania without an ally in the east. With the Czechs neutralised, the Prime Minister saw Poland as the key to the situation. He proposed asking the Poles whether they were prepared to join ranks with the countries threatened by German aggression. The minutes of the meeting 2 days later reveal the extent of the cabinet's trifling concern for Polish independence. The real issue was if Germany showed signs that she intended to proceed with her march for world domination, we must take steps to stop her by attacking on two fronts. We should attack Germany, not in order to save a particular victim, but in order to pull down the bully, end quote. On the 24th of March, Halifax told the US ambassador, Joseph Kennedy, that he, quote, felt the inevitability of war, sooner or later, should be met right now, end quote. On the 24th of April, the English and French general staffs met for a military conference in London. Here they debated, quote, Anglo-French military cooperation in North Africa and Far Eastern colonies, along sea lanes and in Gibraltar, Singapore, and other strong points against Germany, Italy, and Japan. The publicly announced purpose of the conference, the defence of Poland, was not discussed. For the English, it was a matter of preparing a global confrontation against commercial rivals, end quote. There was many MPs who in every session would repeatedly ask what on earth the government was doing. Frequent requests were made to actually just discuss things with Hitler to see what was going on, but every time they were shot down. For example, Chamberlain once replied, quote, I have nothing to add. And on another occasion on the 31st of March, quote, no negotiations are at present contemplated with the German government, end quote. Hitler, meanwhile, was begging to talk to the British government. When the Brits made their promises to Poland, the Führer tried to talk directly to the English. He knew that the new Polish attitude was entirely reliant on the Brits. Richard Tidor writes, quote, Halifax received an embassy report on April the 23rd that Hitler wished to meet with an especially prominent British personality, fluent in German, for a man-to-man conversation to reach an understanding with England. 2 weeks later, Sir Francis Fremantle, a renowned physician and Conservative MP, unaware of Hitler's request, suggested sending the former Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, to meet with Hitler. Halifax replied to Fremantle, at the moment, unfortunately, Hitler shows no disposition to receive an Englishman, or even to discuss outstanding questions with us. This was a plain lie, end quote. The Brits had fallen so far into the narrative that Hitler wanted to conquer the world that they had decided they should go to war for any reason at all, real or invented, and that they should not negotiate under any circumstances. The world would never be the same again. Over the last 2 chapters, I've attempted to display the relationship between Germany and the British Empire, or perhaps rather Hitler and the British Empire. The relationship was very one-sided, and a very frustrating one at that for Hitler. But in the end, this story isn't entirely about Hitler's love for the British, but it's about the question of Danzig, within which Germany and Britain were both involved. From this point of the video onwards, I will simply recount events as they occurred. Ever since Versailles split Germany in two, East Prussia had been in terminal decline. There was an endless brain drain from east to west, and the entire area was suffering as a result and could barely get off its feet. All this came down to was the issue of the Polish corridor. East Prussia was as German as it gets, but with how isolated they had become, it was simply easier to just make a life in any other area of Germany that wasn't split off. Hitler had attempted measures to reverse this phenomenon, but ultimately, until some kind of agreement was reached with the Poles, it was never going to work out. This gave Hitler yet another reason to open up the question of Danzig and the corridor. The issue of Danzig itself had never really been forgiven. Every German government during the interwar period, all across the political spectrum, felt immense anger about its loss and wished deeply for its return. Polish-German relations could never quite get off the ground. The antagonism would always be there, and it was exactly as Lloyd George had said. Versailles had created an unsolvable issue. Hitler swore from the moment he came to office that one day Danzig would be reunited with the Reich. He would do anything to achieve it. He called it the Nuremberg of the North. He wore the Danzig emblem on his cufflinks. Danzig was the very symbol of what the Germans viewed as the unjust Treaty of Versailles. The Germans in Danzig themselves were perhaps the most nationalistic Germans that existed in the world. They were absolutely begging to be reunited with Germany. Meanwhile, the Germans themselves within Poland, not Danzig, were being treated horrendously. All 1.5 million of them were clamouring for a return home, and tensions were bitter. In late 1938, Hitler considered it high time that he make his move and reach out a hand to Poland. Before the conclusion of the Czech crisis in 1938, Ribbentrop offered the Poles Carpathian Ukraine in exchange for Danzig. This region was highly coveted by the Poles, and by this time they had created their own port nearby anyway. They could survive without Danzig. On top of this, Ribbentrop said that the Poles could keep control of the economic and railway facilities in Danzig. Germany just wanted Danzig on paper, as well as a, quote, extraterritorial motor road and railway line to connect the two halves of Germany. If the Poles would accept such a deal, then Ribbentrop told Ambassador Lipski that the two states could pursue a, quote, joint policy towards Russia on the basis of the Anti-Comintern Pact. Hitler was offering the Poles an alliance against Russia. Hitler didn't share the Prussian bias against the Poles. For centuries, the Protestant Prussians and the Catholic Poles had butted heads. This had nothing to do with Hitler from extremely Catholic Austria. He respected Pilsudski for stopping the Bolshevik push westwards, and had nothing against his eastern neighbour, at least, not yet. The Poles detested the Russians even more than the Germans did. If the old rivalry could be put aside, then they would be the most natural allies on earth. Patrick J. Buchanan writes in his book, Hitler, Churchill and the Unnecessary War, quote, "The role he had in mind for Poland was that of partner in his new order in Europe. Italy, and eventually Hungary and Romania, would accept this role. To Hitler's astonishment, Poland refused." End quote. Hitler was bewildered. It was like the Britain issue all over again. Whilst Hitler saw Europe as it was, the Poles lived in another realm, much as the Brits did, but in a different way. The Poles were still high off the defeat they had inflicted on Russia nearly 2 decades ago. They considered themselves a great power. No one else did. A.J.P. Taylor wrote in The Origins of the Second World War, quote, "They forget that they had gained their independence in 1918 only because both Russia and Germany had been defeated. Now they had to choose between Russia and Germany. They chose neither. Only Danzig prevented cooperation between Germany and Poland. For this reason, Hitler wanted to get it out of the way. For precisely the same reason, Beck kept it that way. It did not cross his mind that this might cause a fatal breach." End quote. Buchanan continues on to describe the general situation from all sides, at least when everyone was thinking clearly. Quote, "Indeed, of all the German claims to lost lands, the claim to Danzig was strongest. It had always been a German city. Its population was 95% German. Any plebiscite would have produced a 90% vote to return to the fatherland, and Britain had no objection to Danzig's return, as long as it came about peacefully through negotiation, not violently through military force. On Danzig, the basic British and German positions were almost identical. Both wanted its peaceful return to Germany, but the Poles adamantly refused to negotiate." End quote. The issue was put to one side after this until the following year. In January, Hitler tried again. Polish Foreign Minister Beck was invited to the Berghof. Beck was a strange man. Poland at this time was a militaristic state led by a clique of puffed-up army types high on their own egos. Logic was hard to come by. Beck, in particular, was far from trusted. William Manchester wrote, quote, "No one questioned Joseph Beck's ability. His remarkable diplomatic skills had led to his appointment, at the age of 38, as Poland's foreign minister, respected for his intellect and powerful will. He was also distrusted, even detested, for his duplicity, dishonesty, and in his private life, depravity. In Rome, where he had spent an extended visit cum vacation, the Princess of Piedmont had said of him that he had the sort of face you might see in a French newspaper, as that of a ravisher of little girls." End quote. And Richard Overy wrote, quote, "Poland was almost certainly the most disliked, and her foreign minister the most distrusted. Poland's pursuit of an independent line left her bereft of any close friends by the end of 1938. The Western powers saw Poland as a greedy, revisionist power, illiberal, anti-Semitic, pro-German. Beck was a menace, arrogant and treacherous." End quote. This time at the Berghof, Hitler had a new offer. He explained once more that Danzig could remain under Polish control, and he made sure to stress that a connection with East Prussia was, quote, "as vital as a matter for the Reich as the connection with the sea was for Poland." End quote. Ribbentrop and Hitler tried to sweeten the deal from last time, and they hinted incredibly strongly that Polish concessions over Danzig could be compensated at Slovakia's expense. Beck refused, so Hitler tried to sweeten the deal even more. Poland was offered permanent control of the corridor, and Hitler offered a guarantee of Poland's borders if the Poles would let the Germans construct a very thin rail and road route across the corridor. Beck, once again, refused. The issue was put on ice again during the impending Second Czech Crisis, and it was this crisis which changed a lot of minds in Britain. The German occupation of Bohemia and Moravia was hardly black and white. Hascher had in fact asked Hitler to step in and protect his country from the impending disaster that was inevitable at this point. The state simply wasn't functioning. At the end of the day, however, Hitler had invaded and occupied a foreign country, and to outsiders this was horrifying, regardless of the context. Hitler's upbringing helped him with the Polish issue, but hampered him with the Czech one. Czechs were absolutely detested in Austria-Hungary, and Hitler was no different. When the Czechs had their own state, it was almost criminally belligerent against Germany, and Hitler as a result relished the opportunity to smash the Czechs. In the end, he would never get the satisfaction, but he did occupy them, and this must have pleased him to no end. Despite this hatred, he was happy to place his feelings to one side, and he did deeply respect and admire the Czechs' new leader, Hascher, who did actually try to turn around the anti-German sentiment. Back in Britain, however, things were reaching a point of no return. MP Harold Nicholson wrote in his diary that the quote, feeling in the lobbies is that Chamberlain will either have to go or completely reverse his policy, unless, in his speech tonight, he admits that he was wrong. They feel that resignation is the only alternative. All the tadpoles are beginning to swim into the other camp, end quote. The other camp was Churchill and the paid warmongers. Hitler couldn't have given them a better opportunity, and he had in fact given them something real for once. Around the same time as this, the Romanian war scare happened, and with it, Eastern Europe was opened up to British intervention. Anyone hoping to oppose this policy, with the current feeling in Parliament, would have been deemed insane. Chamberlain, now dying, was racked by doubt. He didn't know what to do. It didn't matter though, as around now, it was as if Halifax took charge. The same Halifax who had openly stated that he wanted war with Germany on any pretext. Buchanan wrote, quote, Halifax now began to take control of British policy towards the Reich. He informed the Prime Minister that his speech of March the 15th would no longer do, end quote. The very next day, the Romanian war scare happened. Chamberlain was finished. Talea, the Romanian who ran around like a headless chicken screaming about war, was actually the one who suggested that Poland might join as a third ally. Halifax found this proposal appealing. Within a week, the Brits were reaching out to France, Russia, and Poland to act together against German aggression. The four of them were able to agree, quote, immediately to consult together as to what steps should be taken to offer joint resistance to any action which constitutes a threat to the political independence of any European state, end quote. The Poles torpedoed this offer. Polish Marshal Smigly Reeds, one of the clique running the country, said, quote, with the Germans, we risk losing our liberty. With the Russians, we lose our soul, end quote. The Poles chose to side with neither the Germans nor the Russians. They chose the third option. The third option was 1,000 miles away on an island and couldn't care less about Poles or Poland. On the 22nd of March, things heated up even more when Lithuania agreed to hand over the German city of Memel to Germany, which they had seized almost 2 decades prior. On the 25th, the Polish partially mobilized their army. Hitler was taken aback and simply couldn't understand what on earth the Poles were doing. On the same day, Hitler had taken the opposite step. Hitler issued a directive to his army commander-in-chief, quote, the Führer does not wish to solve the Danzig question by force. He does not wish to drive Poland into the arms of Britain by this, end quote. On the 27th, Ambassador Lipski returned to Germany, where he stunned Hitler even more. He told the Germans that if they continued to try to negotiate over Danzig, then the Poles would go to war with Germany. On the 29th of March, a 26-year-old News Chronicle correspondent in Berlin came to London with, quote, hair-raising details of an imminent thrust against Poland, end quote. This was a false alarm, just like the Romanian scare. Halifax and Chamberlain believed the correspondent. Chamberlain wrote to his sister, stating that he decided then and there that they decided to guarantee Poland. Poland was a nation they saw as belligerent, right-wing, unstable, and anti-Semitic themselves, and they were about to guarantee them over a fake. On the 30th of March, the British ambassador in Poland asked an astonished Colonel Beck whether Poland would object if Britain gave the Poles an unconditional guarantee of independence. Beck quickly accepted. That same day, Hitler left the Berghof and returned to Berlin, where he was shocked for the third time in days. David Irving writes in his book The Warpath, quote, in Berlin, a rude shock awaited him. The next morning, news arrived from London that Neville Chamberlain was about to announce in Parliament that, in the event of any action which clearly threatened Polish independence, and which the Polish government accordingly considered it vital to resist, His Majesty's government would feel themselves bound at once to lend the Polish government all support in their power. This was the first of a sheaf of ill-considered guarantees to be uttered by the British. Its effect was not what Chamberlain had hoped for. At 12:45 p.m, Hitler sent for Keitel. Whatever the origins of England's guarantee, by the time Hitler left Berlin, that is, by 8:47 p.m. on March the 31st, he had given the OKV orders to make all due preparations for war with Poland under the codename White. At Wilhelmshaven, the next morning, he launched a second 35,000-ton battleship, the Tirpitz. It is to be emphasised that he had still not issued any actual instruction for war. The new OKV directive on White, issued on April the 3rd, merely outlined a political situation which might make an attack on Poland necessary on or after September the 1st. Meanwhile, the OKV ruled that friction with Poland was to be avoided, a difficult injunction since the Poles had certainly not behaved kindly towards their own ethnic German minority. During April, and again in May 1939, explicit directives went out to every Nazi editor not to draw comparisons between what was happening in Poland and what had happened in 1939 in Czechoslovakia, end quote. There was still some common sense in Britain. These men were absolutely flabbergasted. Ernst May wrote of British policy, quote, "A government that a half-year earlier had resisted going to war for a faraway country with democratic institutions, well-armed military forces, and strong fortifications, now promised, with no apparent reservations, to go to war with a dictatorship with less than modern armed forces and wide-open frontiers," end quote. William Manchester wrote, quote, "Englishmen who possessed strategic vision were, with few exceptions, appalled," end quote. Lloyd George, who saw this issue coming 20 years earlier, had similar opinions. Buchanan writes, quote, "We are undertaking a frightful gamble," said Lloyd George. Told by Chamberlain the pact with Poland would deter Hitler, the former Prime Minister burst out laughing. "If the British Army General Staff approved this," said Lloyd George, "they ought to be confined to a lunatic asylum," end quote. Liddell Hart said that the guarantee was, quote, "foolish, futile and provocative, an ill-considered gesture that placed Britain's destiny in the hands of Polish rulers, men of very dubious and unstable judgment," end quote. Hart also wrote, quote, "The Polish guarantee was the surest way to produce an early explosion and a world war. It combined the maximum temptation and manifest provocation. It incited Hitler to demonstrate the futility of such a guarantee to a country out of reach from the West, while making the stiff-necked Poles even less inclined to consider any concessions to him, and at the same time making it impossible for him to draw back without losing face," end quote. Liddell Hart duly resigned as military correspondent of the Times in protest. Duff Cooper, perhaps the arch-warmonger after Churchill, was getting cold feet. He wrote in his diary, quote, "Never before in our history have we left in the hands of one of the smaller powers the decision whether or not Britain goes to war," end quote. The retired Secretary of the Committee of Imperial Defence, Sir Maurice Hankey, wrote to Ambassador Phipps in Paris, quote, "The whole point is that we cannot save these eastern nations," end quote. None of these men understood the point. The idea was that it was insane. Halifax and Chamberlain, for a time, had already decided on war. It was as if they were sleepwalking and no longer realised the gravity of the situation. They were simply resigned to a world war. They were making no attempt to stop it. They put the fate of the British Empire, as well as millions of lives all over Europe, in the hands of a clique of deranged Polish colonels. There was one man, however, who was over the moon about the latest news, and that was the man who was being paid a fortune to push for war with Germany. Winston Churchill said in Parliament, quote, "The preservation and integrity of Poland must be regarded as a cause commanding the regard of the world," end quote. 9 years later, Winston Churchill would lie through his teeth in his memoirs, quote, "And now Great Britain advances, leading France by the hand to guarantee the integrity of Poland, of that very Poland which with hyena appetite had only 6 months before joined in the pillage and destruction of the Czechoslovak state. Moreover, how could we protect Poland and make good our guarantee? Here was a decision taken at the worst possible moment and on the least satisfactory ground, which must surely lead to the slaughter of tens of millions of people," end quote. These words are so disingenuous that it's hard not to go off on a 10-minute tangent in response. But in short, we know full well that Churchill was the very man who had been absolutely hounding Chamberlain and making his life hell for months to draw a line in the sand and threaten war. Churchill, in the 1948 memoir, was trying to lump all the blame for the war on the now dead ex-Prime Minister, Chamberlain, for doing exactly what Churchill was telling him to do. What Churchill was actually saying at the time was far different. He said in spring 1939, quote, "If you will not fight for the right when you can easily win without bloodshed, if you will not fight when your victory will be sure and not too costly, you may come to the moment when you have to fight with all the odds against you, and only a precarious chance of survival. There may even be a worse case. You may have to fight when there is no hope of victory, because it is better to perish than to live as slaves," end quote. As those watching this video well know, if you compare this quote with Hitler's actual thoughts on the British, then it is almost hard not to laugh. The Brits were in no way, shape or form in danger of becoming slaves. Churchill was just warmongering. As for the guarantee, however, regardless of blame, war was now nearly inevitable. The fate of the world rested with Poland. Luigi Villari wrote, quote, "It rendered the Second World War almost inevitable, for a quarrel between Germany and Poland, even if capable of a peaceful settlement, might now be converted into Armageddon at the caprice of whoever happened to be in power in Poland at the time. Chamberlain, by no means a warmonger, had evidently been driven into this act of madness by the followers of Churchill and the Labourites, whose programme was to make war inevitable," end quote. Chamberlain, of course, wasn't the only man responsible. After all, Halifax was running the show now. His motives were mainly economic. He felt that if Germany could sign deals with the rest of Europe, like she had with Romania, then the British blockade would be useless, and the British would be finished as a great power. He feared that Poland would be next to sign such a trade agreement, and this was partly his motive when he pushed for the guarantee with them. Yes, the foreign minister of the British Empire was willing to send millions of British men to fight and die in Europe and around the world just so that Germany could not become more economically self-reliant. If Germany managed this, then Britain could no longer have the ability to enforce starvation blockades on Germany like they did in the First World War. Halifax said that the guarantee was necessary to the cabinet in the following terms, quote, "The real issue was Germany's attempt to obtain world domination," end quote. Yet he also admitted that, quote, "There was probably no way in which France and ourselves could prevent Poland and Romania from being overrun," end quote. Poland was simply an excuse. There was never any attempt to save Poland. There was no plan, no money sent, no support. Poland was just an excuse to go to war with Germany. Buchanan wrote, quote, "Rather than see Poland return Danzig to the Reich, Halifax preferred that Poland fight Germany to the death. In a war, Halifax knew Poland could not win, because the British could not help. To Halifax, Poland's suicide was preferable to having Hitler chalk up yet another bloodless coup. The Holy Fox appears to have had no reservations about pushing Poland to its death in front of Hitler's war machine to exhibit his willingness to fight for the great moralities, such as the moralities of great powers," end quote. There was one thing the Brits failed to take into account when they made this guarantee of Poland, however. In the East, there was a great power that was far more powerful than any of them. The Brits had been buttering up the Soviet Union for months now, but Stalin took the British negotiators for a joke. Stalin was a politician, firmly rooted in cold, brutal realities. The Brits were offering him nothing solid, and their little games bounced right off him. He knew full well they just wanted him to do all the fighting for them, whilst the Brits sat back and defended. The Brits had nothing realistic to offer to Stalin. He asked for the Baltic states. The Brits hesitated. They couldn't take such a step. No other solid counter-offers were made. The Brits had not secured the East when they took the plunge and guaranteed Poland. While the Brits continued to negotiate like amateurs, another leader stepped in who was entirely serious, and Stalin himself began to look for a better deal. Shortly after the British guarantee, there was only one option left to the Germans. The British were attempting to encircle Hitler. Poland's cause was now Britain's. There was only one power on planet Earth who could possibly put a check on Britain's guarantee and make them think twice. Goering's aide, Luftwaffe General Karl Bodenschatz, dropped this hint right in the Poles' lap. He said that if Germany appeared to be getting encircled, then Hitler would be more than happy to make a deal with the devil himself. Quote, "And you and I are well aware of who that devil is," end quote. Initially, Hitler used this idea purely as diplomatic leverage against the Poles, but Stalin was actually genuinely interested. The Soviet war minister was dropping hints to the German ambassador. He said that Stalin and Hitler should revise their opinions of each other. No matter how much the two men were ideologically opposed, they both had a begrudging respect for the other, and they certainly had their similarities. At around the same time, a high Soviet embassy official remarked that Germany and the Soviet Union could pursue a great policy, side by side. At the end of April, Hitler's usual rhetoric against the Soviet Union had stopped. The usual anti-communist tirades were curiously absent. Those dreaded so-called Judeo-Bolsheviks had disappeared overnight. On the 3rd of May, Stalin made an obvious concession to Hitler. He fired his Jewish foreign minister, Maxim Litvinov, who would obviously have been a serious thorn in the side of any deal with the extremely anti-Semitic Germany. The now infamous Molotov was hired in his place. Hitler immediately got the hint and called back several Moscow embassy officials to report directly to him about the mood there. Hitler also ordered feelers to be put out to the new foreign minister in regards to trade negotiations and a possible reapproachment. On the 5th of May, Propaganda Minister Goebbels ordered all anti-Bolshevik agitation to cease. At around the same time back in England, Neville Chamberlain was going through his usual periods of self-doubt, this time in the opposite direction. Or perhaps he had been in control this entire time and was just being trickier about it. On the 3rd of April, Chamberlain wrote a letter to his sister. It reads that the guarantee was, quote, "unprovocative in tone, firm, clear, but stressing that the important point that we are concerned with is not the boundary of states, but attacks on their independence, and it is we who will judge whether this independence is threatened or not," end quote. The claim by Chamberlain here is that the guarantee of Poland was literal. The guarantee was of Poland's independence, not her borders. During the letter to his sister, he references that the Times newspaper was the one and only newspaper to pick up this important detail. Chamberlain had often used newspapers as a way of secretly talking to Hitler in the past. He would always get someone to inform Hitler of this on his behalf. Graham Stephen tries to explain, quote, "The Polish guarantee was not intended to make war with Germany inevitable. On the contrary, the commitment was intended to give Britain leverage in forcing Poland to come to terms with Hitler's demands over Danzig and corridor questions. In this way, Hitler could be satisfied without Poland being subjected either to a full-scale invasion or succumbing to a treaty that reduced her to vassal status." End quote. When this came out with the article in the Times, Churchill went absolutely ballistic in Parliament, and once more essentially accused Chamberlain of appeasement. Manchester explains what Geoffrey Dawson of the Times actually wrote in this important article. Quote, "Dawson had written, 'The new obligation which this country yesterday assumed does not bind Great Britain to defend every inch of the present frontiers of Poland. The key word of this statement is not integrity, but independence. The Prime Minister's statement,' the editorial continued, "involves no blind acceptance of the status quo. This country has never been an advocate of the encirclement of Germany, and is not now opposed to the extension of Germany's economic pressure and influence, nor to the constructive work she may yet do for Europe." End quote. Buchanan writes, quote, "Dawson had either been privately informed or had ferreted out the truth. Appeasement was not dead. Chamberlain had not declared that Britain would fight to keep Danzig from Germany, only that Britain would fight for Poland's independence. Chamberlain was signalling Hitler that the return of Danzig was not opposed by Britain, and she would go to war only if he tried to destroy Poland as an independent nation. The British war guarantee had not been crafted to give Britain a pretext for war, but to give Chamberlain leverage to persuade the Poles to give Danzig back." End quote. This fact, if true, wasn't understood by Hitler immediately. He had slammed his fists down on the table when he first heard the news of the guarantee, and shouted, quote, "I will brew them a devil's drink." End quote. The Poles, too, did not read Chamberlain's guarantee in this way either. From the day of the guarantee, the Poles refused to even discuss the question of Danzig with Germany. The Poles felt invincible. They now had the backing of the Great British Empire. Surely the nation, known as Perfidious Albion, wouldn't have ulterior motives. How far you read into this narrative regarding the tricky wording is up to you. Chamberlain's policy is confusing and hard to pin down. He seemed to be playing every single side at once. Every historian seems to have a differing opinion. On the 23rd of April, Hitler said to Goebbels at lunch that Chamberlain had put out feelers to Berlin. He was up against stiff opposition back in Britain, however, and the newspapers were having a field day. Almost all of them were pushing for war, as if they had forgotten the bloodshed of the last one. Many of these papers were owned by Churchill's friends or paymasters. With this immense pressure, Chamberlain had to implement conscription 3 days after he put these feelers to Hitler out. He did make sure to get word to Hitler beforehand, and tried to assure him that conscription wasn't aimed against Germany, but this can't have been very reassuring to Hitler. Another man, like Churchill, who desperately wanted war more than anything, was Franklin Roosevelt. Over in the US, he was trying to work propaganda wonders to whip up feelings against Germany. The American people were staunchly isolationist at this point, and it was this fact that Roosevelt wanted to change. Neither he nor Churchill were fans of Chamberlain. They were diametrically opposed to each other. Chamberlain was a devout, peace-loving Christian who shivered at the very thought of bloodshed. Both Roosevelt and Churchill were atheists who detested Christianity. Both were also high-level Freemasons with very, very sketchy connections. Their moral codes simply did not line up with Chamberlain's. Irving sums up Roosevelt's involvement in April 1939. Quote, "Hitler hitherto had felt able to ignore President Roosevelt's forays into European politics. He blamed Roosevelt's posturing on Jewish influences and believed that isolationism was still a powerful force in the United States. In April 1939, Hitler was the recipient of an open letter from Roosevelt, appealing to him to give public assurances that he would not attack any of 31 specific countries. Wiretaps on the US Embassy in Berlin revealed that staff there regarded this appeal as a gaffe. Hitler gave these assurances in a sarcastic Reichstag speech on the 28th. The Kroll Opera House rocked with laughter as he added sardonically his own personal promise that the Reich was not planning to invade the USA either. The FA wiretaps noted that US Embassy staff conceded that the Führer had won the match. In the same Reichstag speech, he revoked the 1934 non-aggression pact with Poland and the 1935 naval agreement with Britain too. In private, he justified his stiffer attitude towards Britain by the secret documents now found in Prague archives. "One day we'll publish them to all the world to prove Britain's dishonesty," Bodenschatz told a French diplomat. End quote. Irving continues on to describe Chamberlain and Stalin's feelings at the time. Quote, "A month earlier, the USSR had opened talks with Britain and France, but Stalin knew that Hitler had more to offer. On May the 25th, the FA wiretaps on the Times correspondent in Berlin, Mr. James Holborn, showed that he had learned while in London that Chamberlain did not have his heart in an alliance with Stalin. He still hoped one day to resume his direct contacts with Hitler. On May the 17th, the Soviet charge in Berlin, Astakov, had hinted that, on present form, the talks were going against the British. 3 days later, Molotov himself declared to Hitler's ambassador that trade talks with Germany could be resumed just as soon as the necessary political basis had been established. Ribbentrop discussed at length with Hitler how this vague remark might be interpreted. The outcome was that Wiesacker was instructed by Hitler to put his carefully worded message to Ashkatov. "You can be our friends or our enemies, the choice is yours." End quote. Meanwhile, it appeared as if Hitler wasn't set on war or anything of the like just yet. He still wanted the corridor question solved peacefully. According to Halder, he said at the time, quote, "I would have to be a complete idiot to slither into a world war, like the nincompoops of 1914, over the wretched Polish corridor." End quote. Meanwhile, Ribbentrop was guaranteeing the Italians that peace could be assured for at least a few more years. He saw no imminent danger, just yet. In fact, whilst all this fuss about Germany had been going on, Mussolini had struck out like a hyena whilst the world was distracted and occupied Albania. Whilst anyone could see some sense in Hitler's claim in the corridor, nobody could see any sense in Mussolini's current strategy. Albania had never been a part of Italy. There was nothing linking the two states. For the past 2 decades, the Albanians had been pushed around and accepted concession after concession from Mussolini, and now he simply occupied their nation and sent King Zog packing. Chamberlain was livid. He wrote to his sister that Mussolini had behaved, quote, "like a sneak and a cad. He had not made the least effort to preserve my friendly feelings." End quote. Churchill then rushed out as usual and demanded immediate action. He requested an immediate invasion of the Greek island of Corfu. Yes, a Greek island, not an Italian one. Churchill assumed this would be Mussolini's next move. This way, the Brits could keep the Italians in the Adriatic and preempt Mussolini. They would be violating a nation's neutrality, and the Greeks were especially enthusiastic about theirs. Around this time, the French began to receive fake war scares, much as the British had earlier. A German invasion of Romania was supposedly imminent. The French then said that guarantees should be issued, and Chamberlain went along. Guarantees were then handed out all over Europe. On the 13th of April, Greece and Romania were guaranteed. A month later, a treaty of mutual assistance was signed with Turkey. Lloyd George was livid and couldn't understand the policy. "Either make a deal with the devil and jump into bed with Stalin, or don't," he said. There was no way Britain, who had only 2 divisions ready for combat in France, could save Eastern Europe if it came to it. Now, they were only provoking what they were seeking to stop. Quote, "Without Russia, these 3 guarantees to Poland, Romania, and to Greece are the most reckless commitments that any country has ever entered into. These are demented. Madness. Did the General Staff advise the government before they entered into these commitments? If they did, they ought to be removed from the War Office and confined to a lunatic asylum." End quote. On April the 6th, Lord Halifax and Churchill, who was now gaining ever more influence, decided that Yugoslavia would be a good recipient of a war guarantee. Days later, the Liberian ambassador turned up seeking a guarantee too. On the 18th of April, the world was hit with a shock. Adolf Hitler for the first time openly stated his offer to the Poles. Alan Bullock describes the offer, quote, "With Poland, too," Hitler declared, "he had been only too anxious to reach a settlement. Poles and Germans had to live side by side, whether they liked it or not, and he had never ceased to uphold the necessity for Poland to have access to the sea. But Germany also had legitimate demands for access to East Prussia and the return of the German city of Danzig to the Reich. To solve the problem, Hitler had made an unprecedented offer to Poland, the terms of which he now repeated, with the careful omission of the German invitation to join a bloc directed against Russia." End quote. Essentially, it was the offer he had given the Poles previously, but it was now public. The world would know the truth. Dozens of British MPs were taken aback. What on earth had they been supporting? Hitler wasn't out to conquer the world after all. The British ambassador in Berlin, Neville Henderson, a pretty fair man who genuinely wanted to patch things up with Germany, although he wasn't a fan of National Socialism, wrote to Sir Horace Wilson, Chamberlain's closest advisor, quote, "I must admit that I regard Hitler's proposals as a fair basis of negotiation, and in my innermost heart, I regard the Poles as exceedingly unwise to make enemies of Germany and as dangerous allies for us. The Prague coup has affected our whole outlook towards Hitler, but it has not altered the merits of the Danzig corridor case in themselves. I may be wrong, but I am personally convinced that there can be no permanent peace in Europe until Danzig has reverted to Germany. The Poles cannot be masters of 400,000 Germans in Danzig, ergo, Germany must be. I am sure that I feel that way, but I fear that we are again on a bad wicket, as we were over the Sudeten." End quote. Buchanan writes, quote, "Beck would refuse to even discuss Danzig with the Germans, and the British would refuse to press Beck to negotiate. Hitler thus concluded that Britain was behind Poland's intransience, and that Britain was committed to war to prevent Danzig's return. The conclusion is understandable. The conclusion was wrong, for Chamberlain still believed Germany's case for Danzig was her strongest territorial claim, and favoured the return of the city, if only Hitler would go about it peacefully, which was exactly what Hitler at that point was still trying to do." End quote. Whilst the Brits regretted their decision to tie themselves to Poland, they simultaneously tried to plunge themselves deeper into the hole they had dug. The courting of Stalin continued, although thanks to Chamberlain, most would say correctly, this was dead in the water. His issues were as follows. Firstly, from Chamberlain, quote, "I must confess to my most profound distrust of Russia. I distrust her motives, which seem to me to have little connection with our ideas of liberty, and to be concerned only with getting everybody else by the ears. Moreover, she is both hated and suspected by many of the smaller states, most notably Poland, Romania, and Finland." End quote. Secondly, the Brits actually agreed wholeheartedly with the German demands. This is Churchill on the 13th of April, 1933, before he was a paid warmonger. Quote, "Many people would like to see, or would have liked to see, a little while ago, I was one of them, the question of the Polish corridor adjusted. For my part, I should certainly have considered that to be one of the greatest practical objectives of European peacekeeping diplomacy." End quote. Thirdly, an alliance with Russia made little practical sense, as they would have to be allowed to march through Poland and Romania to assist. Neither state would ever allow this, as both states detested Russia far more than they detested Germany. Both nations have witnessed the horrors of Stalin's rule so far. Millions had died just over their border in Ukraine in the forced starvations there. Fourth was the Baltic issue. Stalin wanted to at least impose protectorates over the Baltic states, and at most he wanted to fully annex them. Perhaps the former would have made the latter inevitable. There was no way the Brits could agree to this, at least not under Chamberlain. Fifth was an obvious one. The Brits wanted Stalin to declare war on Hitler if he attacked Poland. Stalin quite rightly proposed that the opposite should be part of the deal too. If Hitler attacked Stalin, then Stalin wanted the Brits to come to his defence. This was something the Brits couldn't bring themselves to do. They literally had nothing to offer Stalin, yet they had opened negotiations with him. They wanted something for nothing. Stalin was many things, but stupid wasn't one of them. William Henry Chamberlain writes, quote, "Whether the Soviet Union would have entered the war, even if demands had been granted, is doubtful, but it was politically and morally impossible to accede to those demands. For this would have amounted to conceding to Stalin that very right of aggression against weaker neighbours, which was the ostensible cause of fighting Hitler. Such glaring inconsistencies may be tolerated in war, as the records of the Tehran and Yalta conferences testify, but the coercion of friendly powers to part with sovereignty and territory was impossible in time of peace." End quote. Buchanan writes of the endless contradictions, quote, "Nor could Britain commit to war to defend a Bolshevik state whose very reason for existence was the destruction of Christianity and Western civilization. Why should a single British soldier die to save a Stalinist regime whose departure from the earth all decent men would celebrate? Yet, in a supreme irony of the 20th century, Britain's greatest champion of an alliance with Stalin turned out to be that same Churchill who had championed the Allied intervention to strangle Bolshevism in its crib, and who had been England's most ferocious and eloquent anti-communist." In a September 1936 column, Enemies to the Left, written after the show trials of the Bolshevik Old Guard, Churchill wrote, "What is the meaning and effect in this oppressive scene of the Moscow executions?" Churchill answered his own question. Stalin's regime, he wrote, had taken on the same anti-Semitic and nationalistic features as Hitler's. He said, "Many people, unable to be shocked at the expiation of these miscreants who have bloodily sent uncounted thousands of good men to their doom, were nonetheless sickened at the elaborate farce of their trial. Its technique throws a gleam of intimate light upon the mysterious nature of a communist state. We see the gulf between communist mentality and the wider world. The second point to notice is that these victims were nearly all Jews. Evidently, the nationalist elements represented by Stalin and the Soviet armies are developing the same prejudices against the chosen people as are so painfully evident in Germany. Here again, extremes meet, and meet on a common platform of hate and cruelty." End quote. Yet in 1939, Churchill was once again lying through his teeth. Quote, "The loyal attitude of the Soviets to the cause of peace, and their obvious interest in resisting the Nazi advance to the Black Sea, impart a feeling of encouragement to all the eastern states, now menaced by the maniacal dreams of Berlin." End quote. If Churchill were to head to the streets of Riga, Helsinki, or Bucharest, and told the people of these eastern states this, they would have laughed in his face at the very least. End quote. If Churchill were to head to the streets of Riga, Helsinki, or Bucharest, and told the people of these eastern states this, they would have laughed in his face at the very least. Just a couple years later, all of them would choose to side with Hitler when made to pick a side. The Poles continued with their refusal to negotiate, and Hitler bided his time. The Soviets continued to put out stronger and stronger hints that they would be happy to negotiate. They were sick of the British and their abysmal offers. Hitler knew, however, that time was on his side. In fact, he headed off to the Berghof for the summer. There was nothing the Allies could offer Stalin, and the offer would still be there if he needed it. After all, an alliance with Stalin was the last thing Hitler would have hoped for 6 years ago when he came to power. It was more of a last resort. Irving writes of the situation by July. Quote, "Whilst Hitler stayed at Beirut in July 1939, the foreign clamour mounted. Ambassador Herbert von Dirksen reported from London that the British press had been crying rape ever since the annexation of Austria. What interested Hitler more was that authoritative voices could now be heard from London, indicating that Chamberlain was casting around for ways of divesting himself of the awkward guarantee given to Poland. Hitler had mentioned to Wolfgang Huell as recently as June, after King George VI had replied warmly to Hitler's condolences on the loss of the submarine Thetis, that if only he could meet some Englishmen of standing with whom he could talk with in German, he could soon settle their country's remaining differences. By late July, the signs were that Chamberlain and his advisers were preparing for a second Munich. On a British initiative, there had been talks between Sir Horace Wilson, one of the main appeasers among Chamberlain's advisers, and one of Goering's economic staff, Dr. Helmuth Volkwat. Wilson had proposed a sweeping political, economic, and military agreement with Hitler, in return for certain assurances. "Perhaps I'm too much of an optimist," the Englishman said, "and perhaps the solution does not seem unrealistic to many observers in the present situation, but I have had the opportunity of studying the Führer, and I believe that the Führer, acting as a statesman for peace, can manage even greater achievements than he has already in his construction of Großdeutschland." End quote. What was Hitler to make of this, however? The Poles were not budging, and the situation within Poland itself was getting worse. Hitler had to prepare for the worst, no matter how much Chamberlain appeared to be changing his mind. At the end of the day, it seemed as if Halifax was actually the one in charge now, and Churchill was getting more and more influence by the day, which would guarantee war. Firstly, there was the matter of war itself. After intense discussing with all aspects of the German armed forces and the security services, a plan was hashed out. The army said that the 25th of August should be the day to make the move. If mid-September came around, then the weather could potentially make life difficult for any panzer operations. It had to be late August, otherwise Germany would be taking huge risks. Hitler was given until the 15th of August, quite a while away, to make up his mind. After then the cogs would be in motion, and it would be extremely hard to bring things to a stop. Last time, Hitler almost had to drag his generals into a war with the Czechs. Now, Hitler's generals were itching to go to war with the much-hated Poles, and Hitler was the one holding them back. At this point, the Soviet and German diplomats were still just teasing each other. There was one man who simply just wanted to get on with it, however, and it was his name that would go down in the history books for his efforts. John Toland writes of the situation that summer in his book Adolf Hitler. Quote, "On the political front, Ribbentrop authorizes resumption of talks with Ashtakov on the day Hitler was enjoying Tristan at Beirut. Although the results delighted the foreign minister, Peter Kleist warned him not to let Stalin see that Germany was in a hurry, and above all, not to negotiate any special offers, merely to conclude a pact. They should wait, and probably within 6 months reach an agreement that would satisfy both parties." Ribbentrop laughed. They could sign a pact within a fortnight. He ignored Kleist's advice to be patient, and in his eagerness to complete a treaty that would checkmate England, instructed Schulenburg to meet Molotov again and propose serious political talks. At this meeting, on August the 3rd, the German ambassador got the impression, so he reported, that the Soviets were determined to sign with England and France if they fulfill all Soviet wishes. This was certainly the impression Molotov hoped to make. Both he and Stalin had noticed the eagerness in the Wilhelmstrasse and were tempting the Germans while leading on the British." End quote. Hitler too was getting impatient. The Brits were doing nothing to rectify their guarantee, which they themselves viewed as a mistake. On August the 9th, the situation got worse. Germans in Danzig told the Polish customs official that they could no longer carry out their normal duties because of the way the Poles were acting at that moment. Poland demanded that the Germans in Danzig cancel this action, to which the Senate of the Free City of Danzig denied that such an order had ever been issued, and claimed that Poland was just looking for a pretext to threaten Danzig and claim the city for themselves. The Poles then directly threatened Germany, and told them that if Germany attempted to intervene with this mini Danzig crisis, then it would be seen as a German act of aggression, aka we will consider it an act of war and utilise our guarantee with the British. Meanwhile, Chamberlain made his greatest gamble yet. Sir Horace Wilson, Chamberlain's closest confidant, met with Fritz Hess, Ribbentrop's undercover representative. Here, Hess was told by Wilson that the Prime Minister was prepared to offer Hitler, quote, "a defensive alliance for 25 years that could include economic advantages for the Reich and the return of German colonies by stages in due course. In return, Hitler must promise to take no more aggressive action in Europe." End quote. Hess was taken aback and asked Wilson to repeat himself. Surely he had misheard. Wilson duly did so, and Hess was not mistaken. Neville Chamberlain, Prime Minister of Great Britain, had actually just offered Hitler an alliance. Wilson personally typed up this offer and gave it to Hess, who then returned home to the Foreign Office in Berlin. Ribbentrop was immediately impressed. However, he struggled to believe the seriousness of it. After all, this was just a sheet of paper. Where was the public offer? Was this just a ploy to get Germany to not attack Poland? Quote, "When Hitler first heard the proposals," so an eyewitness informed Hess, "he was transported with joy. 'It's the greatest news I've had for a long time,' he exclaimed, and began romancing like a child. The dream of his life, an alliance with mighty England, was coming true. But almost immediately, he had misgivings, and accused Wilson of laying a trap to save the Poles from a well-deserved thrashing." End quote. Elsewhere, the Brits continued to make fools of themselves in front of Stalin. The Anglo-French delegation had taken 6 days to arrive on a slow cargo passenger ship and train, when they could have just flown in a day. This was a stark reminder of what a joke the British negotiations were. During actual negotiations, the Soviets offered to provide 136 divisions for a common defence against Hitler. In return, the British offered to provide 1 mechanised and 5 infantry divisions. It was a joke beyond description. On the 15th of August, it was time for the Germans and the Soviets to finally talk. Chamberlain had shown himself willing to play at all sides, and hadn't made a concrete offer with this so-called alliance. Hitler was most likely correct in the assumption that this was a ploy to stop him attacking Poland, as opposed to a serious suggestion. Ambassador Schulenburg and Molotov met, and they hashed out their issues. The Soviets were particularly interested in the Germans' ability to change Japan's attitude towards them, as well as the German stance on a possible non-aggression pact between the two nations. Ribbentrop almost hysterically urged Schulenburg to hurry these negotiations along. He just wanted things to get moving, so he himself could come to Moscow and get the deal done. Time was running out. On the 25th, it was Invasion Day, unless a miracle happened, and the Poles actually began to negotiate. Things moved along, and a trade agreement was first signed before the main event. The Germans were in a rush, and essentially were just accepting whatever Stalin asked for, within reason. 200 million Reichmarks were loaned immediately, at a 5% interest rate, for the Soviets to purchase machine tools and industrial installations. Things like optical supplies and armour plate, among other technical armaments, were supplied in smaller amounts. The credit would in return be liquidated by Soviet raw materials, which Germany desperately needed, as well as grain and cattle. The Brits would not be starving the Germans out of a war this time around. Things weren't all sorted, however. The Soviets, for one reason or another, weren't willing to receive Ribbentrop until the 26th or 27th of August, 2 days after the planned invasion. At the news of this, Hitler took a risk and personally interjected. He wrote a note to Stalin, asking him to meet Ribbentrop no later than 3 days from now. Hitler spent the next day horribly nervous, and he was caught in two minds. He almost couldn't believe what he was doing. A deal with Stalin of all people. If Stalin said no now, it would be highly embarrassing. The next day, however, approval came. Hitler immediately shouted out, "Now I have Poland, just where I want her." On the 22nd, Ribbentrop set off with Hitler's pilot, Hans Bauer. The flight Hitler took to Berlin to greet Ribbentrop for his return would be the one and only time Hitler ever flew with a pilot that wasn't Bauer. He trusted no one else. He set off with instructions to yield to pretty much every Soviet demand. At the same time, a small handful of Brits were genuinely trying for peace. Above all, they were Sir Horace Wilson and Ambassador Henderson. Wilson had even told the British press attaché in London that he was willing to come secretly to Germany if need be, if it meant they could make an agreement with the Germans. He was searching desperately for any way to get Danzig back into the Reich bloodlessly. Meanwhile, Henderson felt like he was banging his head against the wall. Nothing solid was coming from his government back in London, whilst he was trying his best on the ground. He found Hitler incredibly uncooperative in the last days of August though. Quote, "He is entirely uncompromising and unsatisfactory, but I can't say anything further until I've received his written reply." Roughly, the points made by him were, Poland has been warned that any further action against German nationals and any move against Danzig, including economic strangulation, will be met by immediate German action. If Britain takes further mobilization measures, general mobilization will take place in Germany. I asked whether this was a threat. His reply was, no, a measure of protection, end quote. Henderson met Hitler a second time after reporting this on the 23rd of August. Irving writes, quote, "In their second conversation that afternoon, Henderson argued that it was proof of Chamberlain's good intentions that he was still refusing to take Churchill into his cabinet. The anti-German faction in Britain mainly consisted of Jews and anti-Nazis, he said. After he left the Berghof, Vistula caught Hitler briefly alone and warned that Italy was only lukewarm about war, while the British were the captives of their own foreign policy. Britain and France are bound to declare war. They aren't people you can deal with logically or systematically. They're labouring under a psychosis, a kind of whiskey intoxication. Tomorrow, Chamberlain will rally the whole parliament behind him the moment he talks of war." Hitler disagreed, though evidently without conviction, because Vistula noted that day, "He still thinks he can localise the war, but he's also talking today, at any rate, of being able to fight a general war as well. Until recently, his view on this was very different." End quote. The Brits were slumbering towards war, but apparently, so was Hitler. He had talked of bluffs all the way up until recently, but now this changed. He was coping. There was no strategy for invading France, never mind Great Britain. He kept telling himself that the Brits were bluffing, but at the back of his mind, he knew the most realistic outcome. He just chose not to accept it or plan for it. On the 24th, Ribbentrop called home from Moscow. There was one detail to be ironed out. It was Stalin's greatest demand, the thing the Brits could not give him in good faith, the Baltic states. Stalin specifically requested the ports of Liepaja and Ventspils, or Libau and Windau in German. Hitler reluctantly agreed. He had told Molotov to give Stalin whatever he wanted. He wasn't going to change his mind now. Later that evening, another phone call came. The pact was signed. The terms, as we now know, split Poland into two. Hitler and Goebbels stayed up into the night to take in what they had just done. It was agreed that the invasion of Poland should go ahead at 4:30 a.m. on the 26th. Hitler didn't want to waste any more time. The press in Poland was whipping up an absolute storm against their 1.5 million strong German minority because of current events, and they were feeling the full brunt of Polish anger. It seemed as if every day, more and more Germans were dying. Each time one of these reports reached him, it was as if a family member of his had died. Each and every dead German weighed heavily on his soul, and he vowed to take revenge and prevent more massacres. The following day, the Brits reaffirmed their commitment to Poland, despite the Moscow Pact. The Brits had brought Stalin into the game, but Hitler had won him over to his side. It wouldn't be the last time the Brits would attempt to escalate the conflict, only for Hitler to react more decisively. On the 25th of August, the world woke up expecting this to be it. Early the following morning, Hitler was supposed to be marching in. That same day, he met Ambassador Henderson. Quote, "For over an hour, speaking with apparent sincerity, Hitler put to the ambassador the folly of Britain's throwing away her empire for Poland's sake. He followed with his now familiar offer. After he had settled the Polish problem, he was willing to conclude agreements with Britain, which would, if necessary, assure the British Empire of German assistance, regardless of where such assistance should be necessary. He offered partial disarmament, and even hinted that if Britain waged a sham war to preserve face, he would not begrudge it." End quote. 3 p.m. was meant to be the deadline for the army. After they got started, the wheels would be in motion. If there was to be any attempt to stop the war, it had to be now. The previous day, Hitler sent a letter to Mussolini requesting his official stance on the goings-on. Instead of replying, Mussolini read it, didn't reply, and went off to the beach with his foreign minister, where both of them refused to conduct any business. The 3 p.m. deadline came, and Mussolini did not respond. Hitler pushed on without him. At 3:02 p.m, a pale-faced Hitler told his generals that the invasion was on. At 6 p.m, Mussolini finally bothered to reply, but it was just another speech begging for equipment and raw materials. Hitler was angry, but not surprised. Mussolini and the so-called Italian Empire appeared to be no more than a bluff now things actually got serious. Mussolini was all talk. Hitler was having second thoughts too, however. He really didn't want to fight the English. After all, this was his dream alliance. He loved the British Empire. He loved the British people. Perhaps he had been too hasty. Perhaps he could convince them that Poland wasn't the hill to die on. One last chance. He wanted to pump the brakes, just temporarily. Quote, Brauchitsch arrived at Hitler's residence at 7 p.m. Sober and unexcitable, he agreed that White could be postponed. In fact, he welcomed the delay, as it would shift the emphasis to a properly planned mobilization. He now told Hitler, give me a week to complete mobilization as planned, and you'll have over 100 divisions available. Besides, this way you gain time for your political maneuvering, he promised. I can halt the army before it hits the frontier at 4:30 a.m. At 7:45 p.m, Vormann was dispatched by car to rush the written halt order personally to Halder. When Hitler telephoned Goering, the field marshal asked him how long he intended to postpone White. Hitler replied, very significantly, I'll have to see whether we can eliminate this British intervention. Goering was sceptical. Do you really think 4 or 5 days would change things much? End quote. The halt order reached all but one German patrol, who ended up marching into Poland and attacking on their own, and they suffered accordingly. On the 26th, a letter arrived from Mussolini. He was begging again. Quote, a telegram had arrived during the night from the German ambassador in Rome. It described vividly Mussolini's response at 3:20 p.m. the previous day on reading Hitler's first letter. The Duce had emphatically stressed that he would stand unconditionally at Hitler's side. That tallied with the first version of his reply, as intercepted by the FA. Italy's attitude had, however, dramatically changed. At 11:52 a.m, the FA intercepted Count Ciano's telephone call from Rome to Attalico in Berlin, dictating what he described as Mussolini's demands from Germany. 150 flak batteries, millions of tons of coal, steel and oil, and impossible quantities of molybdenum, tungsten, zirconium and titanium. At noon, Keitel, Brauchitsch and Goering came. Keitel confirmed that the OKV saw no prospect whatever of meeting the Italian demands. At about 1:30 p.m, Attalico brought the list. New was Attalico's demand that all the material must reach Italy before the beginning of hostilities. Attalico complacently assured Hitler that all the figures were correct. At 2:30 p.m, Huell phoned Ambassador von Mackensen in Rome to verify the figures with Ciano. Ciano also insisted that there was no possibility of error. Mackensen was then instructed to see Mussolini and show him the figures, an instruction he found puzzling, since the figures were supposed to have emanated from the Duce in the first place. Controlling his anger, Hitler began drafting yet another letter to Mussolini. He said he would do what he could to meet the demands. End quote. Later in the day, the situation continued. Quote, shortly before lunch, General Milch arrived from Carenhall. It was he who candidly suggested that Italy's benevolent neutrality would be far better during White. Hitler slapped his thigh and brightened. The letter that was finally telephoned to Rome at 3 p.m. reflected this change of emphasis. Hitler asked only that Italy should make sufficient military clatter to contain some of the West's forces. Who needed Italian military assistance anyway? Mussolini confirmed that evening that since Germany could not supply the materials he had requested, Italy herself could not actively participate. Hitler replied with 2 lame requests. He asked his friend not to give the world any clue to Italy's disappointing attitude, and he asked for Italian industrial and agricultural workers for the Reich. Mussolini readily agreed. End quote. On the 27th, Hitler received a report from the propaganda ministry that suggested that the German people were unanimously against war. At first, he was furious. Surely this couldn't be true. But then there was another from the Gestapo, which said the exact same thing. The people trusted that their Führer would take them right to the brink and then pull off a miracle, much like at Munich. War was the last thing they wanted. Hitler too wasn't nearly as war-hungry as portrayed. Reports would reach him of the Brits wanting a peaceful settlement, and he would barely sleep. Should he postpone the Danzig question? Was it worth it? One of the only things driving him forward at this point was the knowledge that Germans were being horribly mistreated and massacred just over the border. There was no way he could abandon them. Still, he wanted it solved peacefully, if possible. There was only days remaining. On the 28th of August, food rationing was introduced, and Hitler immediately implemented the restrictions on himself too. For the rest of the war, he would live in Spartan conditions. This was immediately obvious at the breakfast table that morning. Despite the peasants' breakfast, Hitler was over the moon that morning. Word had come back from a Swedish intermediary of Goering's, who was one of many pursuing a peaceful solution with the Brits. Hitler boasted, as we now know, wrongly, that he knocked the Brits out of the game. He postponed the invasion for another and final time. The new date was 1st of September, 4:30 am. He was sure he could come to a peaceful arrangement with the British by then. What happened next would be memory hold by history. Quote, when Brauchitsch reported to him, Hitler made no bones about his strategy. He would demand Danzig, right of transit across the Polish corridor, and a Tsar-type plebiscite there. Britain would probably accept these proposals. Poland would reject them, and the split would then be wide open. Hitler instructed the Foreign Ministry to draft a set of formal proposals along these lines for the British government to study. The proposals, 16 in all, were so moderate that one of his diplomats termed it a real League of Nations document. He read them out to Keitel in the conservatory. The general naively replied, I found them astoundingly moderate, end quote. The men weren't exaggerating. The Brits quite agreed when they heard them later. Duff Cooper, one of the paid warmongers like Churchill, said he was horrified by how moderate the terms were. They were mild enough to completely turn things on their head and ruin his paymaster's plan. Churchill and his warmongers would look like the aggressors, and Hitler like a benevolent negotiator. Cooper immediately telephoned the editors of the Daily Mail and the Daily Telegraph and asked them to make the 16 points look as negative as possible. But what were these terms? I will actually link the complete document in the description, but this was roughly what the deal was. Danzig would return to the German Reich, non-negotiable. Plebiscite in the Polish corridor, which would be overseen by a four-power commission of Britain, France, Italy and the Soviets. The port of Gdynia and the area around it would remain Polish, no matter what. Hitler respected the Polish right to the sea. During the period in which the plebiscite was being set up, the Germans must be allowed to set up transport through the corridor between Germany itself and East Prussia. A fair population exchange would be set up, if necessary. Any special rights given to Germans in Gdynia or Poles in Danzig would be replicated in the other. Both ports would be demilitarized. An extremely in-depth minority rights agreement would be set up for those who didn't transfer to their respective nation-state. Immediate demobilization of both nations' armed forces. Depending on the result, one side or the other would most likely end up with land separated from the bulk of their people. In this instance, a strip of land the size of a road and railway would be established. In the Poles' case, this would connect through the corridor up to Gdynia. In the Germans' case, this would cross the corridor. This was the gist of it, but I do recommend you read the whole thing. The Brits couldn't believe their eyes when they first heard it. This was what they had been fighting over? It was one of the fairest offers they had ever heard. For now though, Henderson turned up at 10:30 PM on the 28th and stated that the Brits had received definite assurances from the Poles that they were willing to negotiate. Hitler had his doubts that the Poles meant this, but regardless, he said he was more than happy to negotiate with them. Meanwhile, even Halifax was getting cold feet. He was desperately calling the Poles, telling them to stop firing on German minority protesters and to stop the massacres. The radio propaganda too had to stop. The mood in Poland was extreme. It was a state-sponsored genocide. The government was deliberately whipping up hell against the Germans and turning a blind eye to the massacres they themselves were encouraging. On the morning of the 29th, Hitler woke up and decided to accept the British proposal. He would negotiate with the Poles, not that he hadn't been willing to this whole time. He told the British that he expected a Pole to arrive the next day with full rights to negotiate. It was time for the Poles to stop messing around. Now or never. In return for the Poles coming now to negotiate, Hitler agreed that together with the Soviet Union, both nations would guarantee Poland's new frontiers after the acceptance of Hitler's 16 points. On the 30th, Hitler had little hope that the Poles would actually send anyone. All afternoon was spent talking to his generals, making plans for what was to come. The Poles had clearly made up their minds. The Germans were listening to British telephone conversations, and it appeared that the Brits much agreed. They were furious. The Poles were just being their usual selves. The Brits were begging them to negotiate, but the Poles were being deliberately difficult and trying to avoid reality. Instead of negotiating, the Poles mobilised their reserves. The Brits wanted this would make it appear to the international community that Poland was set on war. The Poles didn't care. The Daily Telegraph pointed out that the Poles hadn't honoured their express willingness to negotiate with Germany and had instead mobilised more of their army. The British government immediately confiscated this entire edition, and the next day's paper left out the part about Poland mobilising. That evening, Ribbentrop met Ambassador Henderson again, and Henderson was directly read out all of the 16 points for the first time. Henderson, like every other Brit, was taken aback by how benevolent the terms were, and he asked for a copy of them to take home, but Ribbentrop refused. This offer was for the Poles, and they had not yet sent anyone. Time was running out, and the Germans had essentially given up trying by this point. The Poles wouldn't even talk to them. After this, Henderson asked to see Hitler, but he was refused. The only option for peace was with Poland. Hitler had given up on trying to talk through the Brits. The Poles either had to turn up now, or they would be at war. Early on the 31st of August, Henderson was sharing the same sentiments. He telephoned the Polish embassy and warned them that he had information from an unquestionably accurate source that unless the Poles did something in the next 2 or 3 hours, then war would come. John Tolland describes the mood of that morning. Quote, "The last day of August was a frantic one for men of goodwill. Delirious got permission from Henderson to telephone London, and a little after noon was telling Sir Horace Wilson that Hitler's proposals were extremely liberal. According to Goering, he said, the Führer had put forward such terms with the sole intention of showing the British how anxious he was to secure a friendly settlement with the English. As Delirious was speaking, Wilson heard a German voice repeating the words. Realising the phone was tapped, he instructed Delirious to give his information to Henderson, but the amateur diplomat did not get the hint, nor did he stop when Wilson warned him that he should not get ahead of the clock. Finally, Wilson told Delirious in plain language to shut up, and when he did not, slammed down the receiver." End quote. Meanwhile, Hitler was reaffirming to his generals that the invasion would go ahead. Reports were reaching Hitler of Polish atrocities against the Germans once again, and this time they were off the scale. The reality was bad enough, as we now know, but Hitler in fact had an even worse impression, as he was being giving inflated figures. When he heard how bad things were that day, he shouted, quote, "They'll pay for this. Now, no one will stop me from teaching these fellows a lesson they'll never forget. I will not have my Germans butchered like cattle." End quote. When no action was taken as the morning continued, Henderson was calling the embassy again, begging them to negotiate. Lipski, the Polish ambassador, didn't even bother to go to the telephone. By midday, the Polish strategy was clear. Irving writes, quote, "Soon after midday, the FA's intercept of Warsaw's explicit instructions to him was in Hitler's hands. Lipski was not to enter into any concrete negotiations. He was merely to hand a Polish government communication to the right government. Thus, the Nazis knew that the Poles were merely stalling for time. Lipski went to ground. He can't be found," recorded Goebbels. "For hours at a time, Poland is obviously playing for time." End quote. Less than a year earlier, Lipski had told Hitler that if he could find a solution to Europe's Jewish problem, then the Poles would build him a beautiful statue in Warsaw. Now, Lipski was about to plunge Europe into a war that only the Poles wanted. Meanwhile, Hitler was resigned to what was to come. He still held out the hope, but was basically coping with the suggestion that England and France wouldn't join the war. But he also said that if they did, then, quote, "France and Britain will just put on an act of waging war," end quote. AKA, even if the Brits and French did go to war, they wouldn't do anything, and it would only be for appearance's sake, almost like a phony war. Shortly after 1 p.m, Hitler gave the official order to his generals that things would go ahead. The Polish negotiator still hadn't turned up. There was only hours remaining. Another 5 hours passed, and then suddenly, it should have appeared as if the situation was saved. Well, it would have, if the Germans had not already listened to the wiretaps. The Polish ambassador arrived and walked into Ribbentrop's office at 6:30 p.m, almost 12 hours since Henderson had first begged him to do so. It was the first time diplomatic representatives of Poland and Germany had met since March. Ribbentrop had one question, and one question only. Was Lipski, an emissary, empowered to negotiate? Lipski replied that he merely had instructions, for the time being, to transmit messages back to his superiors. What he didn't tell Ribbentrop was that his actual instructions were, quote, "not to enter into any concrete negotiations," end quote. Lipski was so determined to not negotiate, in fact, that he refused to even look at Hitler's 16-point proposal. Ribbentrop simply said, "Well then, there is no point in continuing this conversation," end quote. The quickest negotiation in history was over. When the Poles left, the Germans cut all communications to the Polish embassy. The Poles had blown their last chance for peace. The Germans were left with their only other option. Later in the day, French ambassador Coulondre called Henderson about Lipski's visit, and told him how Lipski had refused to even read the German proposals. By now, Henderson had been given the proposals in full by Goering, and Henderson had duly had the proposals shown to the Poles, who simply said that the terms were out of the question. Goering had been doing his best, perhaps more so than anyone else during this entire time to avert war. His Swedish go-between, Delirious, was rushing around like an absolute madman trying to avoid the war. At one point, he'd even called Number 10 via the British embassy with Henderson's permission to give him a clear picture. It was the Poles who were obstructing the whole thing, he said. It was an absolutely ridiculous scenario. After the conversation, Halifax was furious with Henderson and told him, quote, "In the future, please prevent persons not belonging to the English mission from using its telephone line," end quote. Meanwhile, Henderson was less than happy with the latest news from his French counterpart. Quote, "But what's the point of that? It's ludicrous, the whole thing," end quote. The conversation then devolved into a shouting match in which both ambassadors ended up slamming down their receivers. And with that, all hope was gone. The Polish government had been given an option at the last moment to avoid war. The British felt the proposals were ridiculously mild. The Brits backed peace. The Poles chose the path of war. By choosing war, the Poles chose the destruction of Poland. They were living in a different reality than anyone else. Toland writes, quote, "The Poles were apparently so confident that they could whip the Germans that they were not interested in discussing Hitler's offer," end quote. The Poles genuinely believed they could win. Meanwhile, there was over 1 million Germans on Poland's border who knew all about the Polish massacres of ethnic Germans just miles away. Almost to a man, they were itching for revenge. There was no hope of this being a clean war. At 8 p.m, Heydrich's infamous fake Polish attack at Gleiwitz took place. An hour later, all German radio stations cancelled their regular shows and instead read out the 16-point German offer, which had been turned down. Quote, "Even unfriendly foreign correspondents were impressed with its reasonableness," end quote. At 11 p.m, the Poles released their own broadcast in response to Hitler's 16-point offer. Quote, "Words can no longer avail the aggressive plans of the new Huns. Germany is aiming at the domination of Europe and is cancelling the rights of nations with as yet unprecedented cynicism. This impudent proposal shows clearly how necessary were the military orders given by the Polish government," end quote. The Poles used Hitler's 16 points as justification for their previous mobilization, provocations, and massacres. No one brought it after having heard the points for themselves. Meanwhile, Hitler went to bed as normal, with the feeling that England and France would not take action. Quote, "To Hitler, the invasion of Poland was not war, only a coup to seize what was rightfully Germany's. It was a localized action, which both England and France, after making face-saving gestures, would surely accept as a fait accompli," end quote. Goering, however, was plagued with doubt. He called Ribbentrop and lost it. Quote, "Now you've got your damned war, it's all you're doing," end quote. When Hitler awoke the next morning, his armies had already pushed miles into Polish territory. At 4:45, they had rolled over the border, whilst the Luftwaffe bombed the enemy airfields, and right from day one, the Polish Air Force was essentially a non-factor. In Danzig itself, the post office actually held out. These postmen held out all day until eventually they were overpowered. The men were discovered to be wearing Polish army underwear and were duly executed. The Führer himself did not put on his party tunic this morning, and he vowed to never put it on again. Now, his nation was at war, and he now wore a more appropriate army uniform instead. Once dressed, he headed off to the Kroll Opera House, the temporary seat of the Reichstag ever since the fire. In front of him were dozens of empty seats, which were normally full. These deputies had been chosen by the draft, the same way any German would be. Hitler stepped up to speak and announced that Germany, for the first time in decades, was now at war. He covered Mussolini's tracks and thanked him for his offer of support, but said that Germany could fight this war alone. He stated that the West Wall, the German equivalent of the Maginot Line on their side of the French border, would remain the frontier in the West. After all, France and Britain had not declared war yet, and Hitler had no designs on either of their territories. He claimed that the pact with Russia eliminated any threat between the two of them either. Hitler then gestured to his new uniform before shouting, quote, "I shall never wear another until victory is ours, not as long as I live," end quote. The deputies applauded all through the speech, but the greatest applause was held for Hitler's statement on how the war would be fought. Quote, "I shall undertake each operation in such a manner that women and children are neither the target nor the victim," end quote. After the speech, the Führer remained in Berlin. Meanwhile in Britain, it appeared as if Hitler may have been right after all. There was no immediate declaration of war. Lord Halifax summoned the German chargé d'affaires, Theo Court, but just told him that the German invasion created a very serious situation. At 5:36 p.m, a message was intercepted from London, in which the British ambassador was to inform the Germans that Britain would stand by Poland if the Germans did not withdraw. Curiously, no deadline was given. Soon after this, another interception was made from the British embassy. This explicitly stated that the note was a warning, not an ultimatum. On the ground, the German army continued to make as much progress as they could. The Poles fought fanatically and without mercy. Germans who were captured suffered some of the worst possible fates. Eyes were gouged out, genitals mutilated and cut off, ears removed, heads decapitated, the list goes on. When Hitler found out about such actions, he would explode, and later in the war would often contrast it to the behaviour of the Norwegian army or others who behaved impeccably. Meanwhile, the ethnic Germans were suffering much the same fate. As the Polish army tried their best to hold off against overwhelming force, they, and the civilian population, took out their impotent rage on their own Germans. Before the invasion, things had been bad. Germans had been butchered by the dozen. Now, entire villages of men, women and children were being executed in indescribable ways. Each German soldier found it his duty to advance as fast as possible, simply to stop this ethnic cleansing. When the advancing troops saw the horrors of the mutilated bodies for themselves, they would behave horrendously in return to the Poles. It was the beginning of a vicious cycle that would culminate in the genocide or expulsion of all Germans east of the Oder River in 1945. The next day, Mussolini stepped in to try to de-escalate, much as he had done in Munich the year before. Quote, "Early on September the 2nd, Mussolini made an attempt to halt the avalanche. He proposed a ceasefire and an immediate five-power peace conference. France was said to be in agreement. For some hours, Hitler appears to have taken seriously the possibility of ceasefire. In conference this same day, he urged the Wehrmacht to seize as much Polish territory as possible over the next few days, particularly the whole Polish corridor. At 9:20 a.m., his army adjutant phoned Rommel not to expect the Fuhrer to transfer to his HQ that day either." End quote. Hitler had in fact arranged through his foreign minister another appeal to the Brits on the 2nd himself already. Quote, "He offered to withdraw his army from Poland and compensate the Poles for damages if London would mediate the Danzig corridor dispute." End quote. In England, Chamberlain stood up in the House of Commons and insisted that German forces completely withdraw from Poland. He spoke of the need for a conference to halt hostilities. Everyone had expected a declaration of war. Parliament sat in stunned silence. Chamberlain's last act of defiance against the warmongers wasn't to have the desired effect, however. Chamberlain had tried his best. He'd been an honourable, peace-loving Christian. He, perhaps more than anyone else in the world, did not want war. He knew full well that Hitler didn't either, and he knew that Hitler meant his 16-point offer. He just no longer had the power to take him up on it. He said afterwards, quote, "I believe he sincerely did believe in an arrangement with us." End quote. He'd done his best, but now the dying old man simply couldn't count on any support. The war party had too much influence. Years of fake crises, paid warmongers like Churchill, and an unceasing propaganda barrage from the press had rendered his position untenable. When Chamberlain left the Commons that night, he, quote, "was told that Tory backbenchers would rise in revolt if the government did not immediately carry out its threat to declare war. 12 cabinet members met in caucus in the chambers of Chancellor of the Exchequer Sir John Simon. They agreed to warn Chamberlain that his government could not survive another day of delay, regardless of what France did. Shortly before midnight, Chamberlain gathered his cabinet and accepted a vote for war." End quote. Chamberlain reasoned that it was better for him to remain at the helm and conduct at least an honourable war, and at most even a phony war, which is what he would spend the rest of his time in office doing. Half an hour after midnight, a telegram reached the British Embassy in Germany. Quote, "You should ask for an appointment with Minister for Foreign Affairs at 9 p.m, Sunday morning. Instructions will follow." End quote. The Germans were given their ultimatum at the appointed time. They had 2.5 hours to remove all of their troops from Poland, an impossible request given the circumstances. At 11:30 a.m, Henderson met with Ribbentrop and informed him that Great Britain was now at war with the Reich. Quote, 10 minutes later, the FA heard the British Embassy report to London that Ribbentrop had handed over an 11-page reply, refusing to give any assurance as to the withdrawal of German troops and putting the blame squarely on Britain. The Germans, said the Intercept report, were very polite. End quote. On that day, the 3rd of September, that would signal the end of the centuries-long British Empire, Chamberlain announced the declaration of war to his people. He looked, quote, crumpled, despondent, and old, and he said, quote, "Everything that I have worked for, everything that I have hoped for, everything that I have believed in during my public life has crashed into ruins." End quote. In Britain, the warmongers like Churchill celebrated their success, whilst the population made arrangements to survive the coming years. Halifax was chuffed too. He had his economic war that he wanted. Little did he know that Chamberlain's successor would actually just sell off all of Britain's assets to the Americans and bankrupt them forever. He said in the House, quote, "Now we have forced Hitler to war." End quote. In Germany, the mood was grim. When Colonel von Bormann got the news of war, this is what he said, quote, Now the worst has happened after all. I'm not a bellyacre or defeatist, but the future looks very grim to me. This is just what we didn't want. Until this morning, the idea was to play for some time somehow and to postpone the decision. Even today, the Führer still believes that the Western powers are only going to stage a phony war, so to speak. That's why I've had to transmit an order to the army at 1:50 PM, not to commence hostilities in the West ourselves. I can't share his belief. He's got the wrong idea of the British and French psyche." End quote. Goebbels was of much the same opinion. This was the last thing anyone wanted. Quote, Goebbels too was beset by misgivings, warning Hitler in a 25-page memorandum entitled Thoughts on the Outbreak of War, 1939, that there was little enthusiasm for this new conflict, and that Britain, poisoned by Jewish capital, would fight to the last man. Britain, he pointed out, is governed by the old men of 1914, who are incapable of thinking straight or logically because of their hate complexes. End quote. Hitler himself couldn't believe it when he got the news, but deep inside he had probably known this was the most likely outcome. Quote, there was complete silence. Hitler sat immobile, gazing before him. He was not at a loss, as was afterwards stated, nor did he rage, as others allege. He sat completely silent and unmoving. After an interval, he turned to Ribbentrop. "What now?" asked Hitler with a savage look, as though implying that the foreign minister had misled him about England's probable reaction. Ribbentrop answered quietly, "I assume that the French will hand in a similar ultimatum within the hour." End quote. According to Hitler's interpreter, Schmidt, Goering was filled with misgivings too. Quote, Goering turned to me and said, "If we lose this war, then God have mercy on us." End quote. The idea that a war with France and Great Britain was desired by Germany must be thrown in the dustbin of history. No one in Germany wanted war with Great Britain, least of all the leading party members. Hitler's final directive of August the 31st read, quote, "The responsibility for the opening of hostilities in the West should rest unequivocally with England and France. The German land frontier in the West is not to be crossed at any point without my express consent. The same applies to warlike actions at sea, or any which may be interpreted as such. Defensive measures on the part of the Air Force should at first be exclusively confined to the warding off of enemy air attacks on the frontier of the Reich." End quote. Great Britain and Germany were officially at war. Both leaders respected each other, and both wanted peace. Chamberlain had been forced into a war he never wanted. He was in an impossible situation. If he didn't declare war now, he would be revolted against by the warmongers, many of them paid, many others whipped up by propaganda. The British Parliament was full of aristocrats who had never worked a day in their lives. This war would barely affect them. They could relax at their country estates, whilst the British population would be bombed to pieces. This is exactly the case with Churchill. He began the bombing campaigns in 1940, and each time a raid would come back, he would be pre-warned and head off to his country estate, whilst thousands died in the streets of the cities in retaliation for Churchill's own actions. He was the perfect encapsulation of the out-of-touch British ruling class. Chamberlain's only hope now was to navigate this war as peacefully as possible, and to his credit, he did exactly this, and for that he can only be admired. For the world, however, it was already too late. Quote, British and French statesmanship had been outmaneuvered by Soviet. What could easily have been a German thrust against the Soviet Union had been deflected against the West. End quote. The Brits were now fighting a pointless and unnecessary war that didn't concern them, in the defence of a Polish clique of army generals whom the British found repulsive. Meanwhile in Germany, Hitler accepted events and headed off towards the battlefield in his special train, the America. In Mein Kampf he had written, quote, Almighty God, bless our arms when the time comes. Be righteous, just as thou hast always been. Judge for thyself whether we have now merited our freedom. Lord, bless our fight. End quote. He would need all the help he could get to get Germany out of this crisis. As Hitler's armies marched into Poland, he hardly intervened. He wasn't the only one not intervening. Quote, on September the 1st, after Warsaw received its war guarantee, not one British bomb or bullet had been sent to Poland. No British credit had been extended. Britain still lacked the power to come to Poland's aid, and Britain had made no plans to come to Poland's aid. The Poles, however, facing the first Blitzkrieg or Lightning War, awaited the promised Allied offensive. General Ironside had told the Poles that German bombing raids on Poland would be answered by British bombing raids on Germany. Within hours of the declaration of war, British bombers were in the air, dropping leaflets over Germany. End quote. It appeared that Hitler could have been right after all. In the West, the French had 110 divisions against Germany's 30, only 12 of which were up to scratch. Yet despite this, they weren't doing anything. Vormann reported of the Western Front, quote, Meanwhile, a propaganda war is broken out in the West. Will the Führer prove right after all? They say that the French have hung out a banner at Saarbrücken reading, "We won't fire the first shot." On the 6th of September, Bormann gave Hitler yet another update. Quote, "The phony war continues. So far not a shot has been fired on the Western Front. On both sides there are these huge loudspeakers barking at each other, with each side trying to make it clear to the other how impossible their behaviour is, and how stupid their governments are." End quote. In the West, there was secret exchanges of food and drink between the French and German lines. It looked more like a dinner party than a war. No one knew what they were fighting each other for. Most men on the front lines would have had at least one family member killed in the First War. And for what? Almost to a man, they knew the ridiculousness of such fighting. There was nothing to gain. Only Churchill and his cronies could gain from such a war. Bormann then summarised the Polish situation. Quote, "All that remains now is a rabbit hunt. Militarily, the war is over." End quote. After this update, quote, "Beaming with pleasure, Hitler took the colonel's hands in both of his and pumped it up and down." End quote. The fate of the Poles was quickly sealed. Irving writes, quote, "The gasoline engine, the tank, and the dive bomber should not have taken the Poles by surprise, but they did. Hitler's armoured and mechanised units encircled the enemy armies while they were still massed to the west of the Vistula. There, they were deployed in preparation for the drive to Berlin, the thrust which would bring about an anti-Nazi revolution in Germany." End quote. The situation seemed entirely under control, and Hitler made sure to keep things that way. Goering begged for permission to bomb the British fleet, but was refused. When Hitler heard that a British transatlantic liner had been sunk by a U-boat, he went berserk. His first thought was that Churchill had actually done it himself to arouse American public opinion, but eventually it came out that it was in fact an overzealous U-boat captain. Both Admiral Raeder and Hitler were livid, but chose to keep the truth to themselves. Once the Polish army was in disarray, it was time to clean up the mess. The Germans were disgusted by what they saw. There were many such cases, but the most famous of all was Bromberg. The local Polish commander had explicitly ordered the massacre of several thousand ethnic Germans on the charge that they were involved with the hostilities, which of course they weren't. On top of this, Goering's paratroopers were being shot on the spot when captured. The population was pouring gasoline over disabled German tanks and frying the crews inside of them. Quote, "Against Germany, the Polish people fight side by side with the Polish soldiers, building barricades and combating the German operations and positions by every means they can." End quote. As Hitler cruised just miles behind the front line, his party was worried sick. His secretary, Schroeder, wrote, quote, "All day long the sun beats down on the compartments, and we just wilt in the tropical heat. The chief drives off in the morning, leaving us condemned to wait for his return. Recently we were parked one night near a field hospital, through which a big shipment of casualties was just passing. Those who tour Poland with the chief see a lot, but it's not easy for them, because the enemy are such cowards, shooting in the back and ambushing, and because it is difficult to protect the chief, who has taken to driving around as though he were in Germany, standing up in his open car, even in the most hazardous areas. On the very first day, he drove through a copse still swarming with Polacks. Just half an hour earlier, they had wiped out an unarmed German medical unit. One of the medics escaped and gave him an eyewitness account. Once again, the Führer was standing in full view of everybody on a hummock, with soldiers streaming towards him from all sides. Obviously, it gives the soldiers' morale a colossal boost to see the Führer in the thick of the danger with them, but I still think it's too risky. We can only trust in God to protect him." End quote. General Rommel was tasked with guarding Hitler at this time, and he was over the moon with the current situation. He said that in 8 or 10 days it would all be over. He had heard reports that the French soldiers in the West were so comfortable that they were bathing in the Rhine and not a single German ever interfered. It was as if being at war had brought them closer together. On the 12th of September, Hitler reminded Goering and Brauchitsch of how things should proceed. He then told them they were not to provoke the French in any way at all. The further Hitler went east, the more he felt he'd been right all these years about his views on race. Western Poland somewhat resembled Germany. It had been a part of the German Empire for a long, long time by that point, until recently. In the east, though, it was a very different story. Irving writes, quote, "Hitler's tours of these Polish battlefields were his first real contact with the East. They reinforced his unhealthy fantasies about the subhumans and the Jews. Was this still Europe? Indiscriminately scattered about the untended acres were wretched wooden hut-like dwellings with thatched roofs. At the roadsides, knots of submissive Polish civilians stood in the swirling dust of Hitler's motorcade. Among them he glimpsed Jews in high-crowned hats and kaftans, their hair in ritual ringlets. They looked for all the world like figures out of medieval anti-Semitic drawings. Time had stood still here for centuries. The Jews were the enemy. Dr. Chaim Weizmann, the president of the Jewish Agency, had written to Neville Chamberlain, promising explicitly that all Jews everywhere would fight on the side of the democracies against Nazi Germany. The Times published Weizmann's letter on September the 6th, and Hitler no doubt considered it a Jewish declaration of war, end quote. As the initial hatred wore off, the German army began to feel disgusted by how brutal the treatment of the Poles was. Himmler's SS especially was the subject of the Wehrmacht's distaste, and in general Hitler was not going to be as lenient with the Poles as he would later be with the Norwegians, the French, and the English in the Channel Islands. General Wolfer Heitz, new military governor of West Prussia, wrote, quote, "I am to rule the area with a mailed fist. Combat troops are over-inclined towards a false sense of chivalry," end quote. Massacres were common. Especially targeted by Himmler and Heydrich was the Polish intelligentsia. Hitler had always said that one way or another this group must be dealt with, but the SS were taking things to unforeseen levels. In some cases, SS generals were kicked out of Poland for being too brutal. There was to be no hope of a Polish nation rebirth if the brains behind such an operation were wiped out. Hitler planned to make a Polish rump state, which he duly did, but it was a brutal one. As for the Jews, they were treated horribly too, and were concentrated in big cities in the now infamous ghettos. By the 19th of September, when Hitler drove into Danzig, the point of the war, said war was almost over. Only Warsaw, Modlin, and Halle were still holding out. The Polish government had already fled to Romania. In Danzig, he was bombarded with flowers, just like he was in Austria, the Sudetenland, and Memel beforehand. Here he talked to his people, quote, "Here, in a long, columned 14th century hall, built in the heyday of the Germanic knightly orders, Hitler delivered a lengthy speech. He compared the humanity with which he was fighting this war with the treatment the Poles had meted out to the German minorities after Pilsudski's death. Tens of thousands were deported, maltreated, killed in the most bestial fashion. These sadistic beasts let their perverse instincts run riot, and this pious democratic world looks on without batting one eyelash." In his peroration, he spoke of Almighty God, who has now given our arms his blessing, end quote. As the month drew to a close, the drama in Warsaw was nearing its end. Endless offers had been refused by the Poles there. The only concession they had granted was that the foreign diplomats were allowed to leave the city. This caused quite a conundrum for Hitler. If Warsaw were smashed to smithereens, it would be a propaganda dream for the war party in the UK. Hitler wanted to make things appear as clean as possible so that he could make peace with the West and be done with this situation. General Blaskowitz wrote in a report, quote, "Hitler was briefed on the 8th Army's plan of attack. According to this, the main artillery assault on the fortress will commence early on September the 26th. Until then, only identified military objectives, enemy batteries, and vital installations such as gas, water, and power stations are being bombarded by ground and air forces. After the plan of attack has been outlined broadly to him, the Führer, who is deeply troubled by the suffering that lies in store for the population of the fortress, suggests that one more last attempt should be made to persuade the military command of Warsaw to abandon its lunatic course. He guarantees that the officers of the fortress will be granted honourable captivity and may retain their daggers if they surrender forthwith, and orders that the NCOs and troops are to be assured of their early release after the necessary formalities," end quote. Irving writes of what came next, quote, "Millions of new leaflets publishing these terms were dropped over Warsaw that evening. The Polish commandant made no response. Early on the 26th, therefore, the target of the artillery bombardment was changed to the city itself, and the infantry assault began. The next day, it was all over. The Poles had capitulated with virtually no further military resistance. On October the 2nd, General Rommel visited Warsaw, and afterward reported to Hitler on the terrible scenes of destruction. Rommel wrote to his wife the next day, quote, "Report in the Reich Chancellery and dinner at the Führer's table. Warsaw is in bad shape. There is hardly a building not in some way damaged, or with its windows intact. The people must have suffered terribly. For 7 days there has been no water, no power, no gas, and no food. The mayor estimates there are 40,000 dead and injured," end quote. When Hitler staged a gigantic military parade in the ruins of Warsaw on the 5th, the city stunk of rotting bodies. Hitler appeared unmoved by this spectacle until he was offered a banquet by the army, in which he declined to take part whilst the citizens of Warsaw around him had just been, and still were, starving. It was now all over. Poland was finished and had suffered such losses that many Poles probably assumed that they were entering another dark age like the 19th century where no Polish state existed. Now, for Hitler, it was time to make peace. At the same time, he prepared for the opposite. He ordered the army to prepare for Operation Yellow, the attack on France and the Low Countries, just in case. Hitler had wavered over whether or not Belgium should be used as in the First War, but by this point, Allied troops were amassing on the Belgian border, ready to be allowed to march through, and in his mind, Belgian neutrality wasn't sincere. Quote, Wiesacker wrote in early October, "The attempt to wind up the war now is for real. I myself put the chances at 20%. Hitler at 50%. His desire is 100%. If he obtained peace, it would eliminate the awkward decision as to how to reduce Britain by military means." Early in September, Goering had hinted to the British through Birger Delaris that Germany would be willing to restore sovereignty to a Poland shorn of the old German provinces excised from the fatherland at the end of the Great War. There would also be a reduction in German armaments. The British response had been a cautious readiness to listen to the detailed German proposals. Hitler told Delaris in Berlin late on September the 26th that if the British still wanted to salvage anything of Poland, they would have to make haste, and now he could do nothing without consulting his Russian friends. Delaris left for London at once, end quote. The battle for Poland was won in a flash, but now the long battle for peace was about to begin. The story of how the bloodiest war in human history began is probably the most important question of our time. Words can quickly turn to violence, and because of the inability for the British, Germans, and Poles to negotiate with each other, Europe and the world at large entered a war in which most would never recover. Europe would never survive another war of even half the scale of the Second World War. Yet despite this fact, few cared to look into the actual lead up to the conflict. It's glossed over as random German aggression. But is any aggression truly random? Everything has a reason. What were the Germans' claims? Were they justified? Why were the Poles so adamant not to negotiate? I hope I've been able to answer most questions about this vitally important time in our history. Every hill isn't worth dying over. Danzig, at the end of the day, was a German city. If you feel that the millions of lives lost over that cause was worth it, then that is your opinion. But I feel like most people who have reached the end of this video would probably disagree with you by now. The reality is that the Poles had a choice to make: Russia or Germany. The Poles detested the Russians far more than they detested the Germans. They knew what life was like under the Russians. Alternatively, they knew what life was like under the Germans, which hadn't been an enjoyable experience either. Hitler wanted an alliance with them against the Russians, and undoubtedly, this would have come at the loss of some sovereignty. These two options were binary, however. It was always going to be one or the other. The Poles chose neither, and in the end, they got the worst of German brutality and then ended up as not only a Russian puppet state, but a communist Russian puppet state, their two biggest fears. Today, Poland is once more sovereign, and with a border that stretches far further west than it once did. About 1/5 of the Polish population died during World War II. If that sacrifice and roundabout way of doing things to get to the modern day was worth it, then once again, that is your opinion. I could go over who cared more for peace and who cared more for war during this whole situation, but I think the video speaks for itself, and I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much for watching. If you made it to the end, then that's pretty impressive. I'm assuming this video will be well over the 2-hour mark. I hope you enjoyed watching this video as much as I enjoyed making it. If so, then please do leave a like, a comment, and share the video if you got all the way here. It helps more than you can imagine. As always though, the biggest thank you goes to my Patreon, Subscribe Star, and YouTube members who make these videos possible. These videos aren't monetized immediately, and I need to wait for a manual review, which can take a long time. As a result, I am purely able to do this as a full-time job, thanks to the kind subscriptions that you guys provide on these sites, and I cannot thank you enough. If you do want to support the channel, join our Discord or our weekly Hearts of Iron 4 games, then please do consider clicking one of the links in the description. Thank you. Thank you to Lobster2U, Darway Lololol, Sigmar, Emperor Titus, Luke David Murphy, Chechen Natsok, Anton Berglund, Levi E, Friendly Brian, Mr. Malabar, Bushak, Firefly Enterprise, Henry Unruh, Evan Brightfield, Chef Jeff, Ethan Winstanley, Wunderwaffe, Mr. Bloom, Gav D, Gaius Longanese Hanno, JD, Green Rebel, Angus Roxburgh, Rocksacker Too Heavy, Alexios Podcast Watcher, Citadel, Haste, Bojan M, Rick Me, Mr. Gaming, Cameron, Sludwig 1919, Gloomy, Troy Harser, Jagdkampf, Rowan, Swedish Chef, Honda, Mirko, David Byers, Max Anton, Gragas, Conqueror, Espen, Khan, Luka Marincic, Veritas Unleashed, The Real G, Joel, Ghost 0128, Jack, Bobby Atkinson, John DeGrief, Ward, Crankless, Dramatic Equation, Russ Hale, Senator Armstrong, Lucas Drury, Mark Smith, Shameful Display, Sneed Seed and Feed, Bruno, Emma Magashmail, William S, Ozymandias, Sword Dog, Aussie ones, Prada, Aussie Zuma, Joe Ford, Jive Ginseng, Mr. Toad, Leigh Agnew, Carolyn J, Alex D, Violently Normal, Brendan Stout, K. Reich, Unlikely Balmer, Enclave, Welcome to Kali Yuga, The Alt Vault, It's Okay to be a Nationalist, Inflection Point, Vet Exempt, Automat 762X39, Monsoir Mercier, Charlie Black, Will from Florida, History by Grayscale, The Waller, Suma Klubayek, Jorgen 1997, Admiral Kempinski, Carl Jung, and James Ferris.